Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Story 1. It was past midnight when Emily arrived at the house, and the fog rolled in thick, swirling around the headlights of her car like ghosts from some forgotten time. The road had been narrow, winding through dense woods that pressed in from either side, turning the journey into a blur of darkness and fog. It felt as though the world had been swallowed whole, leaving her alone with nothing but the car's hum and the occasional distant screech of a lone owl. The house loomed ahead like a monolith, its silhouette barely visible in the gloom. Emily felt an unsettling chill crawl up her spine as she parked the car in front. The place looked abandoned, decaying in the shadows, the paint peeling from the walls and the windows covered in grime. She grabbed her bag, stepping out into the damp night air. Her boots sank slightly into the wet ground, the earth soft from the day's rain. The wind picked up, tugging at her coat, and she shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else, a feeling that was too much like being watched. She hesitated at the doorstep, a lump forming in her throat. There was something off about this house. She had been told it was an old family home long forgotten by time, but the stories she'd heard, whispers in bars, hushed conversations, suggested more than that. People had been talking for years about the house at the end of Lurking Hollow Road. Not many came back from it. Her fingers brushed the key in her pocket, the weight of it pressing against her skin. It had been her last resort after everything else had fallen apart. Her brother's disappearance, the foreclosure on her parents' home, the endless string of bad decisions that had led her here. She had nowhere else to go. A creak echoed from inside the house as she pushed open the door. It was barely a sound, but enough to make her pause. Her heart skipped in her chest. It was as if the house had sighed in relief at her arrival. Or maybe it was something more sinister. Emily stepped inside, the door groaning shut behind her, leaving her in the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows. The air smelled musty, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, just a shadow flitting past the doorframe. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat, the hairs on her neck standing up. Nothing. Just the wind playing tricks on her. She sighed, trying to shake off the tension, but the feeling wouldn't leave. She pushed forward, crossing the threshold into the dimly lit hallway, and tried to focus on her task, finding a place to rest for the night. She would figure out her next move in the morning. The house was a maze of corridors and doorways, all of them dark and silent. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the quiet pressing against her ears, so heavy she could almost taste it. She didn't know what she expected. Perhaps dust-covered furniture, empty rooms, or some kind of relic from the past. But what she found instead was far worse. The silence here wasn't empty. It was waiting. And as Emily moved deeper into the house, she began to hear things. Little noises at first, a faint rustle behind her, the soft tap of footsteps on the floor. It was impossible to tell if they were real or if they were just the house settling, but each time she turned, nothing was there. She found her way to the kitchen and glanced around. The space was cluttered with old, forgotten things, rusted pans, cracked mugs, and dirty dishes piled high in the sink. She moved to the counter, setting down her bag with a small thud, and noticed a note pinned to the wall. "Welcome home." The words were scrawled in an uneven, spidery hand, the ink slightly smudged as if it had been written in haste. Her stomach twisted as she scanned the note again, her heart hammering in her chest. The words felt wrong, as though they weren't meant for her at all. She stepped back, her mind racing. Who else had been here? Why had someone left that note? But before she could ask herself another question, the lights flickered. A low hum buzzed from the light fixture overhead, and then, all at once, the room was plunged into darkness. Emily's breath caught. Panic gripped her chest. The oppressive silence returned, thicker now, and the temperature seemed to drop, as if the very air was turning cold. She reached for her phone in her pocket, but before she could pull it out, she heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards behind her. Her blood ran cold. Her eyes darted to the shadows, searching for movement. Nothing. Just when she thought she might be imagining things, a distant sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking through the hall behind her. She turned toward the door, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The house was still. The shadows lingered at the edges of her vision, playing tricks on her. A door slammed open somewhere in the distance, its echo reverberating through the house. Emily jumped, her breath hitching in her throat. There was no mistaking the sound this time. It wasn't her imagination. Something, or someone, was here with her. She stood frozen for a moment, straining her ears, waiting for the sound of the footsteps to return. But the house was still again, holding its breath. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a text message from an unknown number. "Get out." She read the words over and over as though they might change. But they didn't. The message was clear. Her pulse raced. Who had sent this? And why? Before she could respond, the lights flickered again and the temperature dropped even further. A low, almost imperceptible murmur began to hum in the background, so faint she wasn't sure if it was real. But then she saw it. A shape standing just beyond the doorway. Something, or someone, was watching her. It was just a shadow at first, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate, like a figure coming out of the dark. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs, and in that moment she realized she wasn't alone. The shadow shifted, stretching like a dark stain across the dimly lit hallway. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stood motionless, staring at it. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, elongated, and yet it seemed to move with a kind of purposeful slowness, like a predator inching closer to its prey. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls of the house were closing in around her. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The footsteps she'd heard earlier, had they been her own? No, these were different. These steps weren't hers. They were heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. She stood frozen, her back pressed against the counter as her eyes flicked back to the hallway. The shape hadn't moved much, just lingering at the edge of her vision, but it felt like it was watching her. In a flash, panic overtook her. She had to move. With a shaky breath, Emily grabbed her bag from the counter and darted toward the back door. She didn't even think to check if it was locked. She just needed to get out, away from whatever was in the house with her. But as her hand reached for the doorknob, the entire house seemed to groan in protest. The floorboards creaked loudly under her feet, the sound echoing through the hall like a warning. The figure in the hallway shifted again, closer this time, moving with an unnatural, gliding motion. Emily spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the dark hallway, now empty, as if the shape had never existed at all. She swallowed hard. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. The fear was suffocating, creeping in like the fog that had followed her here. Was it just her mind playing tricks? The isolation of the house, the long drive, the stories she'd heard, had it all gotten to her? Emily forced herself to take a steadying breath. This wasn't real. She had to stay calm. But then the lights flickered again. Once, twice, and then they went out completely, plunging her into the dark. She froze. Her eyes adjusted slowly, the faint outline of the kitchen barely visible in the shadows. A cold chill crept up her spine, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake by coming here. The air in the room was thick with a palpable sense of wrongness, as if the house itself was alive, and it didn't want her there. She fumbled for her phone again, her fingers trembling as she tried to turn on the flashlight. It was the only thing keeping the fear at bay now, that tiny beam of light cutting through the darkness. When the phone finally illuminated, she shone it toward the hallway. Nothing. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The house was silent again, as though it had all been a trick of her mind. But just as she started to relax, the floorboards behind her creaked again. Louder this time. Closer. A voice, low and almost inaudible, whispered through the dark. It was a word, a name, barely a sound. Emily spun around, her heart skipping a beat. The voice had come from somewhere in the room. Her eyes darted across the shadows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had spoken, but she saw nothing. "Hello," she whispered, her voice shaking. No answer. She waited, straining her ears for any sound, but all she could hear was the steady thrum of her pulse in her ears. Then she heard it again. The voice, this time clearer, more distinct. Emily? Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone her name. No one knew she was here. Who's there? Her voice cracked, and for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. The weight of exhaustion, the long drive, and the oppressive silence of the house. It was all starting to blur together. The voice came again, closer this time. Emily? It was like a breath against her ear, a rasp that sent ice through her veins. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room, and there, standing in the corner, was a figure. A man, his features barely visible in the darkness, but the outline was unmistakable, tall, thin, with ragged clothes hanging loosely from his frame. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hair hung in long, tangled strands around his face. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at her with eyes that she could not see, but she could feel them. like two dark pits that pierced straight through her. Emily's heart raced as she backed away slowly, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't know where to go, what to do. The house seemed to press in around her, suffocating, the walls closing tighter with every passing second. The man's lips didn't move, but his voice echoed in her mind. "Leave this place." The words were a command, not a plea, not a warning, but something far more sinister. Emily didn't know how she knew, but she knew the man wasn't real, not in any normal sense. He was something else, something born from the darkness of this house, a shadow that had crawled out of the walls. She turned to run, but the back door, slammed shut with a deafening crash. Her breath caught in her throat and she stumbled backwards, her back hitting the cold wall. "No," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself or to the house, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. There was no escape. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way. A low, guttural sound rose from deep within the house, like the earth itself was groaning, as though it had been disturbed after years of slumber. Emily gasped, stumbling backward, her hands fumbling for something to hold onto, but the ground was shifting beneath her. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to her fear, growing more and more hostile with every passing moment. She didn't know where to turn. Her mind raced, her thoughts clouded with panic. Everything she had ever feared was happening at once. Her past, her mistakes, the endless spiral of misfortune had all led her here. This was no longer a house. It was a prison, and she was trapped inside. Her phone's light flickered and went out, plunging her back into complete darkness. The whispering voice in the corner of the room grew louder, clearer, as if the walls themselves were speaking her name. "Emily?" It was the last thing she heard before the house fell silent again, and she felt the darkness swallow her whole. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Emily stood in the pitch-black room, her breath shallow and rapid, her hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't move. The house, once so oppressive, now seemed to hang in the air like a terrible weight, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. She reached out, blindly feeling for the walls, the cold, rough surface sending a jolt of cold through her fingers. She couldn't understand it. The darkness was so thick, so suffocating, it was as if it had a life of its own. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the fear gnawed at her insides like a ravenous animal. The air felt heavy, like it was pushing down on her chest, and her skin prickled with a cold that seemed to come from deep within the house itself. She could still hear the faint whisper of her name, lingering in the darkness. It was barely a sound, just the slightest rustle in the air, but it was unmistakable. "Emily?" Her name. It came again, but this time it was louder. Closer. Without thinking, she turned toward the voice, her instincts kicking in, pulling her forward, as if her body were already acting on its own, desperate to escape the madness that was closing in on her. She reached for the door, her fingers brushing the cool, weathered wood. It felt strange in her hand, almost too real, too solid, but when she twisted the handle, it didn't open. She twisted harder, panic rising in her chest like a tide, but the door was stuck, held fast by some unseen force. Her heart pounded. The whispers grew louder, the air around her thickening. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the house seeming to breathe in sync with her ragged gasps. Then all at once, the temperature dropped, the chill in the air so sharp it burned her skin. It was like the breath of the house itself, cold and foul, and it wrapped around her, tightening like a noose. She tried the door again, her hands shaking, and finally, with a creak of protest, it swung open, sending a shudder through her spine. She gasped, stumbling back, only to find herself staring into the dark hallway. The same hallway she had walked down before. The same hallway that was now impossibly empty, stretching out before her, a void of nothingness. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her vision. A figure, a flicker of motion that was gone before she could focus on it. The shape of it, the presence, seemed to cling to the edges of her mind, refusing to leave. Emily took a hesitant step forward, her footfall loud in the oppressive silence. She felt the air grow thick around her again, each step pulling her deeper into the darkness of the house. Her flashlight, she still had her phone, still clutched tightly in her hand, barely illuminated the path ahead, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. The house seemed alive with those shadows, each one reaching out for her, curling in on her as she passed. The whispers continued, low and guttural, and now there was a sound beneath them, something far worse, scraping. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like nails scraping against stone. She turned her head sharply, but all she saw was darkness. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her pulse quickening as the sound drew closer. She had to leave. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. She was being hunted by something she couldn't see, something she didn't understand. And it was getting closer. A door slammed shut somewhere in the house, rattling the walls, and Emily's heart jumped in her chest. She jumped back, instinctively raising her phone like a shield, her breath coming in sharp bursts. But she couldn't move. Something was behind her, she could feel it, breathing down her neck. She spun around, the light from her phone flashing wildly, illuminating the dark corners of the hallway. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure, just a silhouette, standing in the farthest corner of the hallway, half hidden by the shadows. She froze, her blood running cold, the air thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The figure stepped forward. A man. Thin, tall, his face obscured by shadows. His clothes were tattered, stained, and hung loosely from his gaunt frame. But what caught her attention was his eyes, black pits, empty and hollow like two gaping voids. His mouth opened, and she saw nothing but darkness inside, a chasm that seemed to pull her in, drawing her closer. Leave? The figure rasped, his voice echoing in her mind. Emily stumbled backward, her feet catching on the uneven floor, but her gaze remained locked on the figure. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. But the man took another step, and suddenly the air around her grew colder still. She gasped, the chill seeping into her very bones. It was as though the temperature had dropped below freezing, the cold so intense it hurt, gnawing at her from the inside. The figure spoke again. Leave, before it's too late. The word sent a shock of panic through her, and for the briefest moment she thought she could see something, a vague, distorted image flickering behind the man. It was like a memory, a flash of something long forgotten, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Emily spun and ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The house seemed to twist around her as she fled, each hallway, each room, each corner familiar yet wrong, as though the house itself were mocking her attempts to escape. She pushed open doors that led to nowhere, stumbled through narrow passages that squeezed her tight, as though the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. Her phone's light flickered once again, and she had to stop, feeling for the edge of the wall as she took shallow breaths, trying to steady herself. She pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving as a new sound began to rise in the distance. A low, almost rhythmic sound, footsteps. Slow and deliberate, drawing closer with each passing second. Emily? It was the voice again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from the floor itself. The walls, the very foundation of the house, seemed to whisper her name, the sound vibrating beneath her feet. And it was then that she realized, this wasn't a house. It was something much worse. The ground beneath her feet began to shake. The walls groaned as if the entire structure was alive, shifting, groaning with some terrible purpose. And then, from the darkness, a single horrifying thought crossed Emily's mind. She wasn't running from the house. She was running from the thing that had been inside it all along. Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat growing louder and more erratic as the house around her seemed to swell with life. The walls seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with every tremor in the floor. She could hear the groaning of the old timber, the twisting, scraping sound of something moving beneath the structure, as though the very bones of the house were alive, shifting in response to her presence. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one there. No figure. No man with those terrible black eyes. The hallway behind her was as empty as it had been a moment ago, the shadows now stretching longer, deeper, reaching toward her like tendrils of something unnatural. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her. Her breath was shallow now, ragged. She needed to get out, to escape this place, but the house, it was turning against her. She could feel it in the way the floors creaked and moaned under her feet, in the way the air pressed in on her chest like invisible hands. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the house itself. It was alive. She stumbled forward, her phone's flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The light seemed to flicker, sputtering as if something were interfering with it. The darkness closed in tighter with every step she took, suffocating her. She reached for the nearest door, her fingers grasping the worn handle, but the moment she tried to turn it, the door refused to open. The metal felt cold under her fingertips, as though it were mocking her attempts to escape. Emily gritted her teeth and tried again, but it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. She slammed her shoulder against it in frustration, but the door didn't give. It was as if the house itself was keeping her trapped, like a spider weaving her into its web. A low rumble echoed through the hallway, followed by a strange scraping sound that sent a wave of cold terror down her spine. She spun around, scanning the shadows, her breath catching in her throat. The air smelled musty, old, like the house had been abandoned for far longer than she had realized. The smell of decay was thick in the air, and her stomach churned with nausea. From behind her, the whispers came again, so faint, so quiet, she almost thought she imagined them at first. But no, she wasn't imagining anything. Emily? The voice was there again, soft, rasping like a breath against her ear. It was close. Too close. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but she could feel it, deep inside her bones, crawling up her spine, sending chills down her arms. She snapped her head around, her phone's light swinging wildly through the darkness. But there was nothing. No figure. No movement. Just shadows. Her chest tightened. Was it the house? The voice? It had to be coming from the house, from the walls, from the very foundation beneath her feet. Something was trying to speak to her, trying to reach out, but it wasn't human. It wasn't something she could reason with. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift again, the boards creaking ominously as something heavy moved beneath them. A tremor rumbled through the walls, shaking the house in a way that made her stomach flip. No, this couldn't be happening. She had to leave. Emily turned and sprinted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the empty space. She wasn't sure where she was going, just that she had to move, had to get away from whatever was closing in on her. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how many corners she turned, the shadows stretched farther, deeper, until the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly. She skidded to a stop at a staircase, the wooden steps creaking ominously under her weight. Her flashlight flickered again, and she cursed, shaking the phone, trying to get the light to stay on. It blinked weakly, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. She glanced up at the staircase. The upper floors of the house were even darker, even more suffocating. She wasn't sure if going up was a good idea, but the hallway behind her was growing colder, the temperature dropping with every second. The floorboards groaned, and the scraping sound, closer now, grew louder. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting. Emily? The voice was louder now, unmistakable. She whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. The staircase behind her seemed impossibly distant, the shadows in the hall stretching and warping into grotesque shapes that weren't quite human. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, her back tightening as if something were breathing down her neck. But when she turned to look, nothing. She wasn't sure if the house was playing tricks on her or if she was losing her mind, but her pulse was racing, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped the phone. It clattered to the ground, the flashlight flickering one last time before plunging the room into darkness. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the silence oppressive, thick, suffocating. She swallowed hard. What had she heard? Was it real? Suddenly, the scraping sound came again, closer now. The noise scraped across the wood floor like something heavy dragging itself forward, and it was coming from the top of the stairs. Emily couldn't breathe. She didn't have time to think. The fear surged through her, a tidal wave that pushed her forward, up the stairs. She ran, her legs pumping, her feet pounding against the old wooden steps that groaned under her weight. She couldn't look behind her. She couldn't risk it. The air grew heavier the further up she went. The walls closed in on her as she reached the top of the stairs. A narrow hallway stretched before her, leading to two doors. One was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. The other was completely shut, the wood worn and aged, but it seemed sturdier. Her pulse raced as she reached for the door handle, but her hand froze inches away from the knob. The whispering came again, but this time, it wasn't just in her ears. It was in her mind. A cold, sharp voice that scraped along her thoughts. "Don't open it." The words echoed in her head like a warning. But Emily couldn't stop herself. She twisted the handle and shoved the door open, stepping into the room beyond. The moment she did, she wished she hadn't. The air was stale, thick with dust and old memories. The room was small, dimly lit by a single window that let in just enough light to reveal its contents. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, dust-covered furniture, a broken mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, and the faint smell of rot that made her gag. But what caught her eye was the object sitting on the floor. A wooden box, old and weathered, sitting alone in the center of the room. The moment she saw it, a cold chill raced up her spine. It was the same box from the photo. The box that had been in her dream. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the wooden box. It sat there in the center of the room, so ordinary in appearance yet carrying a weight of dread she couldn't explain. The same box from her dream. She couldn't bring herself to step forward, not yet. Her legs felt like stone, rooted to the floor by a fear that made her head spin. How could this be? She had never seen this room before, never even imagined such a place existed in the house, but the box felt like a tether, pulling her in with invisible hands. Her eyes darted around the room. The furniture was old and decaying, coated with a thick layer of dust that made the air thick and heavy. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, their faded designs barely visible under the grime. The broken mirror caught her eye again, its cracked surface reflecting nothing but darkness. But the box, it was the only thing in the room that seemed alive. Even now, as she stood frozen in place, she could feel its presence, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. She should turn and leave. The warnings from the house, from the shadows, from the voice in her head, they were all clear. It was a trap. Something ancient and sinister lurked in the corners of this house, and it wanted her to open the box. But curiosity, that dreadful, dangerous thing, gnawed at her. She stepped forward, cautiously, each footfall echoing through the room, the creaking of the floorboards underscoring her growing unease. She reached the box, her fingers hovering above it, trembling with fear. The box was small, only about the size of a shoebox, and it was old. The wood was cracked in places, and strange symbols, worn from years of use, were carved along its sides. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they felt wrong. Dark, ancient, like something from a place that shouldn't exist. A cold gust of wind blew through the room, though there was no open window. It sent a shiver up her spine, and for a brief moment, the air around her seemed to grow thicker, colder. The shadows in the room seemed to twitch, as if alive, as if the house itself were aware of her actions. "Don't open it." The voice, once faint, now seemed to echo in her mind, stronger, louder, more insistent. But she didn't listen. Her fingers brushed against the lid of the box, and her breath caught in her throat. The surface of the wood was smooth, cool to the touch, and as her fingers made contact, a strange pulse ran through her, like the box itself was alive, beating beneath her fingertips. With a sudden rush of energy, she yanked the lid open. The air in the room froze. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that Emily's breath formed invisible clouds, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat she had felt moments before. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, pressing in around her. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, to grow, inching closer with every heartbeat. Inside the box was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Nothing more. But the paper, as she reached for it, felt wrong. It was cold, so cold that it made her fingers burn. It was ancient, brittle, its edges frayed like something that had been hidden for centuries. She unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling in her hands, and as she did, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She felt like she was no longer alone, like the shadows in the room were closing in around her, wrapping around her, suffocating her. The paper held a single word, written in dark ink, a word that seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy. Beware. The word lingered in the air like a curse, settling in her mind like a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. Emily could barely make sense of it. She was shaking now, her fingers trembling as she held the paper in her hands. The word was a warning, but a warning from what? What was it trying to tell her? And then a realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew this word. It was a word she had seen before. It had been on the walls of the house. The same strange symbols, the same cryptic message. The shadows seemed to move, to swirl as if they were alive, creeping toward her. She turned, heart hammering in her chest, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw something in the doorway, just a flicker of movement, a shape too dark to define. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadows had shifted, but she couldn't tell where they had gone. Her phone, still on the floor, suddenly buzzed. Emily froze, staring at it in horror. She hadn't touched it, hadn't picked it up since she'd entered the room. She knew deep down what was happening, but a part of her still hoped it was just a mistake. Maybe it was just a glitch, a trick of her mind. But when she picked up the phone, she saw the message. It was from an unknown number. Asterisk, you should not have opened it. It's too late now. Asterisk. Her blood ran cold. She checked the time, 12:42 a.m. And then, with growing horror, she realized something that made her knees buckle. The message wasn't the only thing waiting for her on the screen. Beneath it was an image, a photo of the box, the very same box she had just opened. Her fingers went numb. She dropped the phone, the screen flashing once before it cracked on the floor. But even as she looked down at the shattered glass, the image remained burned into her mind. The box, the symbols, the darkness, and then came the sound. A faint, distant thudding at first, like someone was knocking on a door far away. But the thudding grew louder, closer. The sound seemed to shake the very air, rattling the walls around her. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps, heavy and slow, but the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. No, it was coming from the room itself. The shadows danced at the edges of the walls, creeping closer, and Emily realized with a sickening certainty that whatever had been sealed away in the box wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a warning. It was real. And it was coming for her. She stumbled back, her feet slipping on the floor as the thudding grew louder, the shadows closing in around her. The air thickened. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring as the room seemed to spin. She had to escape. She had to run. But as she turned toward the door, she saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. A man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that were as black as the night itself. The very same man she had seen before, the one in the shadows. He stood motionless, watching her, and his mouth stretched into a grin, one that was both empty and endless, like a void that swallowed everything around it. The thudding stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have opened it," he whispered, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. And before she could turn to run, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily slammed her hands against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls of the room seemed to close in, pressing against her with a force that felt both unnatural and suffocating. She yanked at the door handle, twisting and pulling with all her strength, but it didn't budge. The door remained solid, unyielding. She could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, creeping closer like an inescapable tide. Her heart hammered in her chest. The figure in the doorway, it was real. The man with the black eyes, that terrible empty smile, he wasn't a hallucination. He was standing there just out of reach, his presence a weight in the air. She could feel him watching her, studying her like she was some kind of specimen under a microscope. She spun around, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, every shadow that seemed to move and stretch in unnatural ways. The box, the one she had opened, was still sitting on the floor, its lid now closed. It was almost as if it had never been opened, like the words on the paper had never existed. But the weight of what she had just seen, the message, the darkness, it was all still with her, pressing down on her like a storm ready to break. What was happening to her? Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together, but it was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. She thought of the whispers, the cold wind, the footsteps she had heard earlier in the hallway. It had all been building to this moment. The house, the shadows, the man with the black eyes, it was all connected, and she was at the center of it. Another sound echoed through the room, soft, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A low, slow creak. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, groan with the weight of something moving within it. Emily turned to face the corner of the room where the sound had come from, her eyes wide with fear. There, in the farthest corner, a crack in the wall had begun to widen, as if the house itself were breathing, expanding, stretching out in response to some unseen force. From within the crack came the faintest glimpse of something dark, shifting like a shadow trying to break free. No. No, asterisk. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. The thudding from earlier had returned, but now it was louder, more frantic, like the footsteps of someone running toward her. The shadows in the room began to warp, twisting and elongating as if they had a life of their own. Emily could hear the whispers again, louder now, circling her like vultures. Asterisk, get out. Get out, asterisk. The words were clear now, not in her mind, but in the room itself, the walls vibrating with the force of them. Emily stumbled backward, her foot catching on the floor, sending her crashing to the ground. Her palms scraped against the rough wood, the pain grounding her, snapping her out of the terror that had begun to consume her. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes still locked on the widening crack in the wall, the darkness within it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't wait for whatever was coming. She had to leave. But the door still shut, still locked. And then, through the growing chaos, something in the room caught her eye. The mirror. The cracked mirror from earlier. It was now completely intact, the shattered pieces no longer broken, the reflection in the glass hole once again. Emily's eyes narrowed, her heart pounding in her chest. How could that be possible? As she stepped closer, the air grew colder still, a biting chill that cut through her clothes like ice. She could see herself in the mirror, but the reflection was wrong. Her face was distorted, twisted in agony, her eyes wide with fear, but it wasn't just her face that was changing. Behind her, standing just over her shoulder, was the man. The figure with the black eyes, standing motionless, his presence filling the mirror. His grin stretched wider, impossible, grotesque, as though his face had been pulled and stretched to an unnatural length. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned sharply, but there was nothing behind her. Nothing but the empty room. She turned back to the mirror. The man was still there, standing behind her, watching her. His eyes were the deepest black she had ever seen, and they seemed to pull her in, consuming her with their darkness. His smile, his grin, it was all teeth, endless, a gaping maw that seemed to devour everything around it. It's not real, she told herself. Asterisk, it's just the house. Just your mind playing tricks, asterisk. But even as she said the words, she knew they were lies. The man in the mirror stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of her terror. Emily could feel her pulse quicken, her stomach turning with the overwhelming need to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, locked in place by the sight of him, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. He's coming for you, the whispers hissed. Asterisk, he's coming. It's too late to run, asterisk. And then, in the reflection, the man reached out. His hand, long bony fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they were made of something other than flesh, slowly lifted toward her. Emily couldn't breathe. Her heart was racing. She had to do something. Anything. She had to escape. But the room, the house, the mirror, everything was closing in on her. The darkness had become thick, suffocating, and the air was now so cold that it hurt to inhale. She couldn't see clearly, couldn't think. Her vision was blurred, her head spinning. Run. The word whispered through her mind like a lifeline, and suddenly, without thinking, she spun on her heel, racing toward the door. She didn't care if it was locked. She didn't care if the man in the mirror was still behind her. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't wait any longer. But as her hand reached for the door handle, the floor beneath her feet cracked with a loud snap. The walls seemed to tremble as if the house itself were shaking, responding to her panic. And then the door opened. It swung wide with a sound like thunder, and Emily stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, her legs weak beneath her. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The house seemed to pulse with an ominous energy as if it were alive, feeding off her fear. The shadows in the hall twisted and flickered, and the thudding sound, closer now, urgent, seemed to follow her every step. She turned the corner and bolted down the hall, the pounding footsteps still echoing behind her, closer and closer. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how many twists and turns she took, the house didn't end. It just kept stretching, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching, pulling at her, until she could hear the man's voice again. It's too late now, Emily. Emily's feet pounded against the old wooden floor, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. Her heart was a drumbeat in her chest, urging her to run faster, to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to crawl after her. She didn't dare look back. She knew deep down that the man with the black eyes was still there, just behind her, waiting for her to falter. The hallway stretched endlessly, an infinite corridor that twisted and turned like a labyrinth. It was as though the house itself was shifting, rearranging, changing the layout with every step she took. The walls seemed to press in closer, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each breath. She could feel the sharp bite of ice in her lungs, her legs burning with the effort of running, but she couldn't stop. I can't stop, she thought desperately. I can't look back. And yet, with each step, she felt herself drawn deeper into the house, into the heart of its darkness. The walls seemed to pulse, alive, as if they were feeding on her fear. The shadows were thick and cloying, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Then, just as she thought she might collapse from exhaustion, she reached a door. It was old, wooden, with peeling paint and a rusty handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door stood slightly ajar, and for a moment, Emily hesitated. Something about it seemed wrong, as if it were a trap, another part of the house's endless maze. But the pounding behind her grew louder, closer. The shadows in the hallway stretched toward her, and she could almost hear the whispers now, cold and insistent, brushing against her ear. Asterisk, open it. There's no other way. You have no choice, asterisk. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she reached for the door. She shoved it open with a sharp push, stumbling into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit room with heavy curtains drawn across the windows, blocking out the moonlight. Dust hung in the air, thick and musty, and the floor creaked beneath her weight. But what struck her the most was the overwhelming sense of déjà vu. She had been here before. She couldn't remember when or how, but she knew this room. The smell, the feel of the air, the sense of isolation. It was all too familiar. And then she saw it. The object in the center of the room, standing in front of her like an unwelcome presence, was a mirror. A full-length mirror, framed in dark, twisted wood, its surface smooth and cold. It was identical to the one she had seen earlier, the one that had shown her the figure in the doorway. Her pulse quickened, the fear rushing back in a wave that nearly drowned her. No, she thought, her eyes wide with panic. Not again. But she couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved as though they had a mind of their own, drawing her closer to the mirror. It was as though the house was pulling her, dragging her toward it with an invisible force. And then she saw it, the reflection that wasn't hers. The man. He was standing in the mirror just behind her. His black eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and his grin, so wide, so impossible, filled the entire reflection. His fingers were long and pale, pressing against the glass as if he were about to step through it. The reflection seemed to move on its own, the man's mouth stretching wider, his features distorting in ways that made her stomach turn. He was no longer just a man, he was something else, something inhuman, something that didn't belong in the world she knew. Emily backed away, her legs trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She had to get out of here. She had to escape before it reached her. She turned, ready to flee, but as she did, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the room with a deafening finality. The light seemed to flicker, the shadows in the room shifting as if the house itself were alive, closing in around her. It's too late now, Emmeline, the voice came again, deep and resonant, vibrating in her bones. Asterisk, you opened the box. You freed me, asterisk. She froze. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the words, trying to make sense of the madness that was swallowing her whole. Freed you? The man, if he could even be called that, wasn't just haunting her. He wasn't just a ghost. Asterisk, he was something worse. Something older, asterisk. Her mind flashed back to the box, the piece of paper, the cryptic warning. Beware, the voice in her head seemed to confirm it, its tone dripping with malice. The box had been a prison, a seal keeping something locked away. And now it was free. Emily's gaze snapped back to the mirror. The reflection was changing, warping, twisting. The man in the glass was no longer just standing behind her. He was inside the mirror, his long fingers reaching through the surface, brushing against the edge of the glass. His eyes never left her face, his grin widening with every passing second. Please, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Please no. But it was too late. The man's hand, now fully out of the mirror, reached for her. His fingers were icy cold, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. Emily tried to step back, but the room had closed in around her. The walls were impossibly close now, the shadows wrapping around her, trapping her in the small, suffocating space. You belong to me now, the voice growled, and Emily screamed as the man's hand closed around her wrist, the icy grip pulling her toward the mirror. No. She shouted, struggling, kicking, fighting against the force that was dragging her forward. But her feet were slipping, her body no longer obeying her commands. She could feel the cold of the mirror, the smooth glass biting into her skin as she was pulled closer, her chest tightening with fear. And then, in one final desperate motion, she reached out with her free hand. She had no idea what she was doing, only that she had to stop him, from getting to her. Her hand touched the glass. For a moment, everything froze. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though the house itself was waiting, watching her every move. She could feel the pulse of something ancient, something alive, coming from the glass, flowing into her. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the mirror cracked. Shards of glass exploded outward, cutting through the air, and the room seemed to tremble, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Emily stumbled backward, her body aching, the sharp sting of the broken mirror tearing at her skin. But as she fell to the floor, the house seemed to shake, the walls groaning with a terrible force. And then a voice. The man's voice. Asterisk, you can't escape me, Emily. You've already made your choice, asterisk. And just like that, everything went black. Emily awoke with a jolt, her body stiff and cold. Her head throbbed as if she had been struck, and her limbs felt heavy, like lead. She blinked, trying to clear the haze in her mind, but everything around her seemed distorted, warped. The air was thick, oppressive, and the silence hung like a suffocating fog. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. The last thing she remembered was the mirror, the glass cracking, the shadows closing in. Had it been real? Had it been a dream? She sat up slowly, her hands trembling as she pushed herself off the floor. The room she found herself in was unlike any she had seen in the house before. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wallpaper, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the air. The furniture was sparse, old, and covered with layers of dust. A small lamp flickered weakly in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. She glanced around the room, panic rising in her chest. Where was she? Had she been brought here? Had she somehow been taken? And then she saw it. The mirror. It stood in the far corner of the room, tall and ominous, just as it had been in the hallway. But now it was whole. No cracks. No shattered glass. The reflection in the mirror was clear, unbroken. Her heart skipped a beat. Not again. But when she looked into the mirror, her reflection was different. It was still her face, her eyes, her features. But it wasn't her. The woman in the mirror looked hollow. Her face was drained of color, her expression lifeless, almost vacant, as if something had already taken hold of her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the mirror was smiling, but the smile was wrong, twisted like the reflection of a thing that wasn't alive. Don't touch it, the thought rushed through Emily's mind with a cold certainty. She had seen this before. She had felt this before. The mirror was not just glass. It was something else. Something dark. Get away from it, she whispered to herself, but her feet didn't obey. They moved of their own accord, dragging her closer to the glass, as though some invisible force was pulling her in. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. The woman in the mirror mirrored her movement, her hand rising to meet Emily's. Don't touch it, the voice inside her head grew louder, more urgent, but it was too late. The moment her fingers made contact with the glass, a surge of cold flooded through her body, a sharp, biting chill that seemed to freeze her from the inside out. Her vision blurred, and for a moment the room around her seemed to dissolve. The walls melted away, the floor vanished beneath her feet, and the only thing she could focus on was the mirror, its glass now pulsing with dark energy, the woman's smile stretching wider. And then she was falling. The floor beneath her gave way, and Emily tumbled into the void. It was as if she were plummeting into an endless abyss, the sensation of weightlessness sending her stomach into freefall. She couldn't see anything but darkness, couldn't hear anything but the roar of rushing air. Her mind screamed, but there was no sound, no sensation of touch, no sense of direction. Please, not again. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the fall stopped. She landed with a harsh thud, the impact rattling her bones. Emily gasped for breath, her lungs burning, the shock of the fall still reverberating through her body. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She was no longer in the room with the mirror. She wasn't even in the house. The air was thick and damp, and the ground beneath her was soft, almost spongy. It smelled of decay and rot, of something ancient and forgotten. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. She was in a forest, or at least what resembled one. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, blocking out the moonlight and casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The air was thick with fog, so dense that she could barely see a few feet in front of her. Where am I? The silence was deafening. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustle of leaves in the wind, no distant calls from birds or insects. Only a thick, oppressive quiet that pressed in on her from all sides. It felt wrong. It felt like she wasn't supposed to be here. A chill ran down her spine. She turned in a slow circle, but there was no sign of any path, no sign of any way out. Only the trees, the thick fog, and the suffocating silence. And then she heard it. A soft, distant whisper, so faint she thought she might have imagined it. But it came again, louder this time, the words clearer, though still hard to make out. Asterisk, help me. Help me, asterisk. The voice was childlike, fragile, pleading. It sent a cold shiver through Emily's veins. Who is that? She wondered, her stomach tightening. Where is it coming from? She hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at her, but the voice called out again, louder, more urgent. Asterisk, help me. Please, asterisk. Without thinking, Emily began walking toward the sound, her legs moving as if they were being pulled by an unseen force. The fog seemed to part ahead of her, allowing her to see just a little farther, and she caught sight of something in the distance. A figure, small and hunched, standing in the clearing. Please, the voice begged again. Asterisk, I'm lost. I need help, asterisk. Emily's pulse quickened. There was something wrong with this. Everything about this place felt wrong. She should have turned back, run, but she couldn't. Something was pulling her toward the figure, toward the voice, toward whatever waited in the fog. She pushed forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes locked on the shape ahead of her. As she drew closer, she saw the figure more clearly. It was a child, small and pale, standing in the middle of the clearing, hands held out in front of them as if reaching for her. It's just a kid, Emily thought, her voice shaking. It's just a kid who needs help. But as she approached, the figure didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The child's face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and the air around them seemed to grow colder, the fog thickening, closing in tighter. Asterisk, don't get closer. Don't do it, asterisk. But Emily was already too close. She reached out, her hand trembling as it neared the child's small outstretched fingers, when suddenly the child's head snapped up, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. It was a mask, smooth and featureless, hollow-eyed and cracked. It stared at her, unblinking, its mouth stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. And then, without warning, the child lunged. The world around Emily exploded into chaos. The fog thickened into a suffocating blackness, the ground beneath her feet crumbled away, and the figure, no thing, ripped at her with claws that weren't human, dragging her into the darkness. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. And then everything went black. Emily's eyes snapped open, her breath ragged as if she had been underwater. Her chest heaved with each breath, the air cold and sharp in her lungs. The world around her was blurry, spinning in circles, and it took her a few moments to realize she was lying on the ground, her face pressed against something damp and gritty. She tried to sit up, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Her limbs were stiff, and her vision swam as she struggled to make sense of her surroundings. The first thing she noticed was the overwhelming smell of earth, wet soil, decaying leaves, and the sour tang of something far worse. It was as if she had been buried alive. Asterisk, no, not again. This isn't real, asterisk. The thought flickered through her mind, but the sensation of cold mud against her skin felt too real. She could hear the faint rustling of branches, the distant creak of something heavy moving through the trees. The fog still lingered around her, thick and oppressive, hiding whatever was just beyond her reach. She pushed herself up slowly, her fingers digging into the ground for support. The world still wavered, but she managed to steady herself, blinking away the dizziness. As her eyes cleared, she realized something terrible. The fog had not only clung to the ground but also wrapped around the trees like a suffocating cocoon, blocking out all signs of the outside world. A chill ran down her spine as she turned in a slow circle, trying to gauge where she was. The forest around her was even more disorienting now. The trees seemed to lean in, their crooked branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching for her. The sound of distant whispers, low, soft murmurs, flickered at the edge of her hearing, but when she turned to look, there was nothing. Asterisk, not again. Not again, asterisk. Her heart hammered in her chest. She pushed herself to her feet, a wave of nausea hitting her as the world spun. Her legs wobbled, threatening to collapse beneath her, but she refused to fall. She had to move. She had to get out. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled forward, her mind desperately trying to pull her out of the fog of confusion. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the mist ahead of her. She froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, slender, draped in dark clothes that blended with the shadows. At first, Emily thought it might be a person, a survivor, someone who could help. But as it drew closer, she realized that it wasn't human. The figure's face was a smooth, featureless mask, like the one she had seen earlier, the one the child had worn. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth was locked in a twisted, frozen grin. The figure's body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though it didn't belong in this world at all. It wasn't moving in any way that made sense, as if it were floating, its feet never quite touching the ground. Get away from it. The thought whispered in her mind, urgent and cold. But Emily was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and something else. Something deeper, something primal that told her the figure wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real. It was here. And it was coming closer. She backed away, her heart hammering louder in her ears. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was getting closer, its pace unnerving in its slowness, as if it enjoyed the fear in her gaze. Please, please don't. And then, without warning, the figure stopped. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just standing there anymore. The figure tilted its head, its mask tilting with it in a grotesque, unnatural motion. The grin seemed to stretch wider, impossibly so, the jagged mouth forming a grin that wasn't a smile at all. It was a warning. Asterisk, it's not here to help you. It never was, asterisk. The words echoed through her mind, drowning out everything else. The figure's grin grew wider, filling the space around her, its dark eyes boring into her soul. And then it spoke. You're mine now, Emily. The voice was cold, distant, otherworldly, but it was unmistakably familiar. It was the same voice she had heard earlier, the same voice that had whispered to her in the darkness. It was the same voice that had followed her since she first stepped into this cursed house. No, Emily shook her head, her body trembling. Asterisk, I won't let you win, asterisk. But the figure's laughter rang out, hollow and cruel, filling the forest with its eerie echo. It seemed to shake the very trees around her, sending shudders through the ground beneath her feet. Emily tried to take another step back, but her legs felt like jelly. The figure was closing in on her, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its shadow engulfing her. She spun on her heel, desperately looking for an escape, but the fog had thickened again, trapping her in this nightmare. The figure's laughter grew louder, filling her ears until she could no longer think, could no longer breathe. And then, just as she thought she might lose herself to the madness, something inside her snapped. With a burst of adrenaline, Emily broke free from the paralysis. She ran, her feet pounding against the wet ground, her breath ragged, her body screaming in protest. The fog twisted and churned around her, but she refused to slow down. She could feel the presence of the figure behind her, a dark, looming shadow that stretched longer with each step she took. It was following her. It was hunting her. I can't outrun it. I can't outrun it forever, But she kept running. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees growing taller, the mist denser. She could hear the branches cracking, the whispering voices returning, curling around her mind like a noose. She had to find something, anything, that could stop this. She had to find a way out. And then, as if in answer to her desperate thoughts, she saw it. A faint light flickered through the fog ahead of her, a tiny, fragile glow, like a distant lantern. It seemed impossible, out of place in this nightmare, but it was real. It was there. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward it with everything she had left, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The closer she got to the light, the more she could see, a small wooden shack, abandoned and forgotten. The door was cracked open just enough to see inside where the light flickered. Please, she thought, please let this be real. She reached the door, slamming it open without thinking. The moment she stepped inside, she was hit with a blast of warmth, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and something else. A familiar, comforting scent, though she couldn't place it. And then the door slammed shut behind her. Emily spun, but the room was empty. No one was there. No figure. No shadow. The light, the lantern, was the only thing that remained. It sat on a small table in the center of the room, flickering softly, casting long shadows against the walls. The room itself was small, bare except for the furniture, and there was an oppressive stillness to it. But as Emily's eyes scanned the walls, she froze. Carved into the wood, etched deeply into the beams of the walls, were symbols. Strange symbols she recognized from the house. Symbols that had been scribbled in the notebooks, the ones that had been all over the mirrors, the ones that spoke of binding and trapping. Emily's heart pounded as she pressed her back against the wooden wall of the shack, her fingers brushing the cold symbols carved deep into the planks. She could feel the energy vibrating from the markings, a dark force that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. The symbols weren't just random carvings. They were part of something ancient, something malevolent. She took a deep breath, her chest tight. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The house, she thought. The mirrors. The symbols. It's all connected, but how? What was it she had stumbled into? What had brought her here? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something moving, something slow and deliberate, scraping across the floor outside the shack. Emily's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. No. She strained her ears, trying to listen, but the sound was growing louder, closer. The thing outside was coming for her, its movements heavy and unnatural, like dragging chains or rusted metal scraping against stone. Her heart skipped a beat. Whatever it wasn't human. Without thinking, she bolted for the corner of the room, her eyes searching for something, anything that could help her. There was nothing. Just the lantern flickering weakly in the center of the room, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. And then she saw it. On the floor just next to the table was a small book. It was old, its leather cover worn and faded with age. The pages were yellowed and fragile, as though it had been untouched for decades. Emily's instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, but something pushed her forward. Something told her this book might hold the key to what was happening here. Her hands shook as she reached down and picked it up. The moment her fingers touched the cover, a chill ran through her spine. The book felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been left out in the snow for years. With trembling hands, she opened it. The pages were filled with a strange script, symbols she couldn't read. But as she turned the pages, some of the symbols began to look familiar, too familiar. There were the same markings she had seen etched into the walls of the shack, the same symbols that had been carved into the mirrors. And in the center of one page, a large, intricate drawing caught her eye. It was an image of the house, her house, drawn in stark black ink. But it wasn't just the house. The image was surrounded by more symbols, and at the top of the page, the words were written in a jagged, disturbing script that seemed to writhe on the page as though alive. The words were something ancient, something terrifying, something that made her stomach turn. The House of the Bound. Her fingers froze on the page. She read it again, her mind struggling to understand the meaning. The House of the Bound? She couldn't make sense of it, but the feeling in her gut told her that whatever it meant, it wasn't good. A noise from outside the shack made her jump. It was closer now. The scraping had stopped. There was silence. Absolute silence. And then, through the silence, a soft voice, whispering. "Emily." The voice was low, familiar, a whisper so close it felt like it was in her ear. She spun, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. "Emily." It was unmistakable. It was her name, her voice, but twisted, distorted, like an echo from the past. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as the voice grew louder, more urgent. "You can't escape." She dropped the book. It hit the floor with a soft thud, and she took a step back, her pulse pounding. No. No, asterisk, she had to get out. She couldn't stay here. Not with whatever was outside. Not with whatever was in the shadows, whispering her name. She scrambled for the door, but when she tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained locked, as if sealed shut by some unseen force. Her panic spiked. Asterisk, I need to get out. I need to get out now, asterisk. Her hands were shaking, and she banged on the door with her fists, her breath ragged in her chest. But the door didn't give. The walls of the shack seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with their dark energy. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their meaning still a mystery, but their presence now seemed to mock her. "Get out." A sharp crack echoed in the room, and Emily whipped around to find the lantern had fallen to the floor, its flickering flame dancing wildly before it sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of the symbols, their dark shapes casting unsettling shadows on the walls. The door slammed open with a deafening crack. Emily froze. The room was silent. The figure outside had entered. A tall, thin shape loomed in the doorway. Its body was obscured by shadow, but the unmistakable mask, smooth, empty, and grinning, was all too clear. The figure stepped forward, its head tilting to the side as if observing her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Her heart stopped. The thing in the doorway wasn't human. It wasn't anything human. It was something darker, something older. The thing's voice filled the room like a low growl. "You're bound." Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the shack with the creature. The walls seemed to close in, their dark symbols twisting and writhing as if alive, as if they had a purpose, to trap her, to keep her here. Emily backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure moved toward her with unnatural slowness, its limbs jerking and twitching as if the body it inhabited wasn't entirely its own. It made no sound as it moved, its feet not even brushing the ground, like it was gliding toward her. "You cannot escape," it whispered again, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Emily's back hit the far wall of the shack, and she was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. The figure's face was inches from hers now, its dark eyes empty, its grin stretching wider than any human face should be able to. "No, please," Emily gasped, shaking her head. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, the suffocating presence of the figure pressing against her, wrapping around her. The figure reached out, its hand a skeletal, elongated claw, and Emily could feel its coldness seep into her skin as it touched her arm. "You are bound," it repeated, and its voice was louder now, more insistent, more final. Everything went dark. Emily's eyes fluttered open again, but this time the world felt different, distant, like a dream that had turned wrong. Her head throbbed and her mouth was dry, but there was no cold earth beneath her, no oppressive weight of the shack around her. Instead, she was lying on something soft, a thick, woven carpet that smelled faintly of mildew and decay. The air felt heavy, thick with dust and something deeper, something that made her skin crawl. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and weak. Her eyes scanned the room and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't in the shack anymore. The walls around her were old, covered in faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges, revealing cracks beneath. The furniture was antique, mismatched and in various states of disrepair. It was a room she recognized, the house star. The same house she had tried to escape. The same house that had haunted her since the moment she arrived. Her heart hammered in her chest. No. This isn't real. This can't be real, But everything about the room felt tangible, from the dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight to the faint creaking of the old floorboards beneath her feet. The room was exactly the same, down to the last detail. Oh. She stood up slowly, her knees unsteady as she moved toward the door. Her fingers brushed the wooden frame, feeling the chill of the old, weathered wood. She could feel the house, alive, breathing in the silence. The feeling was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest, but she forced herself to open the door. The hallway outside stretched long and dark, the shadows thick, like the night itself had settled into the very walls. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant whisper of wind through the broken windows. I have to get out. I can't stay here, She started down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty silence, but every part of her felt like it was being drawn back into something, into the very heart of the house. And then she heard it. A soft, hollow sound like something scraping against wood. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every step she took. It was coming from behind her. The sound was slow, methodical, like a hand dragging its fingers across the walls. It was unmistakable. The figure. Emily froze, her pulse spiking. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The last time she saw it, its empty eyes, its twisted grin, had been enough to break her. The figure was behind her, drawing closer, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it found her again. I have to keep moving. Her feet moved of their own accord, her body driven by fear. The hallway stretched on, longer than she remembered. The wallpaper peeled more as she walked, revealing the raw, exposed wood underneath. The walls were closing in. The house was breathing, and it was alive with hunger. She reached the staircase, her hands gripping the railing for support as she made her way down. Each step creaked under her weight, and she could feel the house's presence pressing in around her. The very air felt charged like static before a storm. At the bottom of the stairs, the living room spread out before her, dim and cavernous. The furniture was covered in white sheets as if abandoned for years, yet the room still felt warm, like it was waiting for her. She didn't know what she was looking for, answers, escape, anything, but she felt drawn to the center of the room. The light from the moon streamed in through the cracked windows, casting strange shadows on the walls. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she saw it. The mirror. It stood tall, framed in tarnished gold, its surface reflecting nothing but blackness. The mirror was the source of all this, wasn't it? The source of the whispers, the shadows, the dreams. The house itself, the force that had taken hold of her, everything started with the mirror, and it had been waiting for her. She walked toward it, her heart racing in her chest, a sense of dread sinking deep into her bones. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air felt. The reflection of the room in the mirror wasn't quite right. It was darker, like the glass was pulling the light from the room. Don't look into it. The thought came suddenly, as though someone was warning her. A flash of memory, a face, a whisper, something familiar, something she couldn't place. But she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to it, the glass pulling her in, twisting her thoughts, muddling her mind. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the mirror. The cold surface felt like ice, sending a jolt of shock through her body. She jerked her hand back, but the reflection hadn't moved. The room was the same. Then a shift. The mirror began to change, its surface rippling like water, warping, distorting. The reflection of the room twisted and bent, and the figure emerged from the glass. It was tall and looming, its mask twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to stretch beyond its face, splitting the darkness around it. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and the space between them seemed to grow smaller, as if the figure was moving closer, inch by inch. "You're bound." The voice echoed through the room, no longer a whisper but a roar that shook the walls. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Emily stumbled backward, her pulse thundering in her ears. The figure stepped forward, its form now spilling out from the mirror, its long limbs jerking and twitching as it crossed the threshold. The floor beneath her feet creaked, and the temperature dropped, icy cold settling into her skin. No, 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 she thought, her mind scrambling, her heart racing. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. The figure loomed over her, its face impossibly close now, its grin stretching wider, wider than a human face should ever be able to. Its voice rumbled in her mind, echoing like a thunderclap. "You cannot escape me. You belong here, Emily." Her body trembled with terror. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt like it was frozen in place, trapped in this nightmare. She could feel the figure's presence pressing in on her, suffocating her, wrapping around her mind, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "You belong here," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. Asterisk, "This is where you were always meant to be. You are bound to me. Forever." Asterisk. But Emily wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't. With every ounce of strength she had left, she turned and ran. The house seemed to groan as she fled through the dark, the walls shifting around her, the air heavy with the weight of something closing in. But she didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She couldn't let the figure catch her again. She reached the front door, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold handle. She yanked it open, the door protesting against her touch, and stumbled into the night. And as the door slammed shut behind her, Emily realized something terrible. She wasn't free. The figure was still with her. Its laughter, hollow and distant, echoed through the air, chasing her into the darkness. The night air was suffocating. It pressed in around Emily as she ran through the overgrown yard, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground. The cold seemed to wrap around her like an unseen hand, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a desperate plea for escape, for freedom, but the darkness refused to let go. She wasn't free. Not really. Behind her, the house loomed like a monstrous specter, its windows glowing faintly in the night as if watching her. The figure, the thing from the mirror, was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, its presence pressing against her like a physical weight. "You belong here," the voice echoed in her mind again. "You cannot escape." It was the same voice that had haunted her, taunting her every step of the way, always just out of reach, always whispering her name. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed forward, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the wind rustling through the trees, but it wasn't enough to drown out the pounding in her ears, the heavy footsteps that followed her every move. Asterisk, "Don't look back. Just keep running." Asterisk. She knew that if she stopped, if she looked over her shoulder, it would be too late. It would catch her. It would take her. The trees around her seemed to close in, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out to grab her. The ground was slick with wet leaves and she slipped, falling to the dirt, scraping her palms against the earth. She gritted her teeth against the pain and scrambled back to her feet, but it wasn't enough to outrun the growing terror. She could feel it now. The presence. The figure. It was getting closer. "You are bound," the voice said again, louder this time, as though it were right next to her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Every part of her screamed to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, weighed down by the force that was closing in. She couldn't escape. Not anymore. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, drawing nearer with each passing second. She could hear the scraping noise again, the sound of fingers dragging along the trees, the ground. And then it was there. A shape in the shadows, tall and thin, its face twisted into that same grotesque grin. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and the air around them seemed to freeze. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. Asterisk, "This isn't real. This can't be real." Asterisk. But it was. She could feel it in her bones, in the pit of her stomach, the crushing weight of inevitability. She had been wrong to think she could escape. There was no escape from this place. From this thing. "You belong here," it whispered again, its voice a raspy breath in her ear. The figure took a step forward, and Emily's breath hitched. She could see it now, more clearly, its long, spindly limbs, its face stretched in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Its eyes were empty, hollow pits, as though all the light in the world had been sucked out of them. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. She backed away, but it followed, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. Every step closer. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the knife she had hidden in her jacket pocket. She wasn't sure why, she knew it wouldn't stop it. Nothing would. But she had to try. She had to fight. She wasn't ready to give up. She raised the knife, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. The figure didn't stop, didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. "You can't stop it." The voice echoed in her mind, filling her head with an unbearable pressure. "You can't escape." And then it was upon her. The figure reached out with its bony hand, and Emily screamed as she felt its icy touch on her skin. It was cold, so cold like the chill of the grave. She could feel it sinking into her, its touch pulling her apart, erasing her very sense of self. "No," she screamed again, her body jerking violently as she tried to pull away. But it was too strong. The figure's grip tightened, and the darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, suffocating her. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the grip loosened. The figure stepped back, its laugh echoing through the trees, hollow and twisted. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her heart racing in her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath shallow. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. The figure was gone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The wind had stopped, the trees still, the world holding its breath. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and steady in her ears. It's over, she thought, and for a fleeting moment she believed it. The terror, the figure, the house, maybe it was finally over. But as she stood up, her body trembling, she saw it again. In the distance, just beyond the trees, the house stood there, dark and looming. The windows were now glowing with an unnatural light. The figure stood in the doorway watching her. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and its grin stretched wider, impossibly wide. "You are bound to me, Emily," it whispered, its voice carried on the wind. "You always have been." And with that, the world began to fade. The trees, the yard, the house, all of it began to blur, as though the entire world was being erased from existence. Emily's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, but there was no ground anymore. There was only darkness. And then there was nothing. The end, or was it? Story 2. The wind howled through the trees, bending them in unnatural shapes. It was the kind of wind that seemed to carry whispers, soft, insistent, like voices calling just out of reach. Lily Dawson pulled her jacket tighter, the fabric a thin shield against the cold that seeped into her bones. She wasn't sure why she'd agreed to this. The house loomed before her, like an old sentinel of forgotten times, standing tall and dark against the twilight sky. Its silhouette was broken only by the flickering light of the distant street lamp, the only hint of civilization she had seen in miles. She wasn't supposed to be here. Lily had been planning on a quiet weekend getaway, somewhere out of the way to escape the noise of the world, but the brochure had promised more than it delivered. This place, the forgotten town of Renfield, wasn't even on most maps anymore. It was a dead stop on the way to nowhere. The house, too, was a remnant of the past, far older than any of the buildings she'd seen in her life. It had been a bed and breakfast once, but the town had shrunk and tourism had dried up. Now it was just an old house with rooms to rent, at a price too good to refuse. She had wanted peace. She had wanted silence. She had wanted to forget. But that was before she saw the house. The closer she got, the more it seemed to press in on her, as if it were alive, breathing with the land, the air, the trees. Her eyes caught sight of the front door, half open, its hinges creaking in the wind. A flood of unease swept over her, but she shook it off. This was her decision, her choice. Taking a deep breath, Lily stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. A loose board caught her heel, and she stumbled forward, catching herself just before hitting the doorframe. It didn't matter. She was here, and she wasn't leaving. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt empty, like it had been waiting. A chill ran down her spine as she gazed at the faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges like something was trying to escape. "Hello?" Lily called, her voice swallowed by the darkness. No response. She could hear the faint tick of an old grandfather clock somewhere deep in the house, but nothing else. She wondered if anyone was even here. The brochure had promised a host, but maybe they were out shopping, preparing for guests. A movement at the corner of her eye made her pause. A shadow. No one was there. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and still. "I must be tired," she muttered under her breath. "This place is messing with me." Her fingers found the edge of the stairs. She hesitated for only a moment before ascending, the stairs creaking under her feet. She didn't know why she was so jumpy. This was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing retreat. Nothing more. Yet, the deeper she went into the house, the more she felt its weight pressing down on her. The darkness seemed to pulse around her. She had reached the second floor when the floorboards groaned again, but this time, it wasn't under her feet. Someone, or something, else was up here with her. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She turned around, her heart pounding against her ribs, but the hallway behind her was empty. The house was old. She would chalk it up to the structure settling. At least that's what she told herself. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should have. She tried to calm her racing heart as she made her way toward the first room on her right. There was something in the air. A sense of dread, a creeping feeling that she couldn't shake. The door was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been, not after she'd heard nothing, seen no one. She placed her hand on the knob, feeling the cold metal bite into her skin as she slowly turned it. The door opened with a groan, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The bed was unmade, the sheets hanging loosely from the mattress, and the window was cracked open, letting the wind carry in a chill. A figure stood at the far side of the room, facing away from her. Lily froze, the breath caught in her throat. A figure, but not moving, not breathing. Her hand slipped from the knob. She stepped back, her pulse racing. But then the figure turned, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A shadow, dark and formless, that seemed to writhe in the corner of her vision. Lily's blood ran cold as it swirled, twisting in and out of shape, its edges curling like smoke. No, she must have imagined it. The house had a way of making shadows play tricks on her mind. Lily stepped back into the hall, the door slowly creaking shut behind her, as though the house itself were locking her in. The hallway felt narrower now, oppressive. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned back toward the stairs. The house was silent again, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the corners of the rooms, waiting for her to make a mistake. But then she heard it, the sound of something dragging across the floor. A scraping noise like nails on wood. The sound was coming from behind her. Lily spun around, but the hallway was empty. Nothing was there. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by the faintest whisper, a murmur so soft she could barely hear it. She was breathing fast, her chest tightening as her thoughts raced. What was happening? This wasn't real. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Another creak, this time from the stairs. Louder. Lily turned, running back toward the staircase, desperate to escape, but the air had changed. It was thick, heavy, oppressive. The house had swallowed the sound of her footsteps, leaving only the eerie silence. She reached the stairs and stopped dead in her tracks. At the foot of the stairs stood a figure. Not a person. A thing. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, dark pits in a face that was both familiar and alien. Lily's breath caught in her throat as it moved, slowly, like it was savoring the moment. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The figure reached for her. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The wind howled once more, the house groaning around her. Lily stood frozen, her heart racing, her hands shaking at her sides. The thing was gone, but the house was still alive. And she had only just begun to understand what it wanted. Lily's hands gripped the banister, knuckles white as she stared down at the darkened hallway below. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, and she couldn't seem to steady herself. She should have run. She should have turned right back around, bolted from the house, and left Renfield behind forever. But something kept her frozen in place, as though the house had latched onto her, unwilling to let her leave so easily. It was a mistake, she thought. She had made a mistake coming here. But now it was too late. The chill in the air wasn't just from the draft anymore. It was something more, something ancient, creeping beneath the skin of the house, pressing in from all sides. The scraping sound had stopped, but Lily could still feel it in her bones, echoing like a faint, unfinished melody, tugging at the edges of her sanity. She tried to breathe deeply, to ground herself, but her mind kept returning to that figure at the foot of the stairs. It had been there, hadn't it? She wasn't imagining it. No, it had been real. Her eyes darted to the end of the hallway, where shadows seemed to deepen, darker than any natural light could create. The house stretched on forever, like an endless maze with no way out. The house. Yes, that's what it was. That's what she kept telling herself. But Lily's heart refused to slow, and her stomach twisted with unease. She didn't want to be here anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house knew her, knew everything about her. She turned back toward the stairs, her mind desperately trying to push the image of the figure from her thoughts. She needed to get a grip. She needed to find the host, figure out where they were, and get answers. Her fingers brushed against the railing as she descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached the bottom, the whispering started. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like wind through a cracked window. But as Lily moved further into the house, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were in the air, inside her head, brushing against her ears. She couldn't make out the words, just the maddening sound of murmured voices, layering over each other in a steady cadence. Her legs felt like lead, unwilling to carry her further, but she had to move. She had to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening here. The living room, she noticed, was eerily still. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving the room cold and dark. The only light came from the slivers of moonlight that filtered in through the heavy curtains, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Lily stepped carefully into the room, her breath catching as her gaze fell upon an old photograph on the mantel. It was a black and white image, faded with age, of a family. The parents stood at the back, their faces stern, their eyes cold, while the children sat in front, small and uncertain. A boy and a girl. The girl looked too familiar. Lily blinked, rubbing her eyes, but the feeling didn't fade. It was as if she had seen that girl before. She couldn't place it, couldn't put her finger on why that face, that sad, hollow expression, seemed to haunt her even now. The whispers grew louder. They weren't in the air anymore, they were inside her head. They clawed at her thoughts, filling her mind with 1,000 half-formed phrases. The words didn't make sense, but the tone, cold, bitter, accusing, did. They spoke of guilt, of regret, of something Lily had long buried in the deepest corners of her memory. "Stop it," she whispered aloud, trying to force the words back. "It's just the house. The house is making me think these things." But the voice, the one she couldn't escape, only grew louder. Louder, until it was like 1,000 voices screaming inside her skull. "You're not alone." Lily's heart lurched as the words resonated within her, vibrating through her chest like a sickening hum. She staggered backward, trying to block out the sound, but it pushed against her, pressing in on all sides. The room around her seemed to darken, the shadows stretching longer, reaching for her. Her eyes flicked back to the photograph, and that girl, her face was clearer now, more defined. She could see her, standing just in front of the family, her gaze fixed on Lily with a strange, knowing sadness. Lily took another step backward, the cold creeping into her bones, but the whispers were relentless, and now they were accompanied by something else. A soft scraping sound, like fingers dragging over rough stone, coming from just behind her. She spun around. Nothing. But there, at the far side of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something shifted. A figure, almost imperceptible, a silhouette in the dark. It was too vague to make out, too fluid, like smoke constantly shifting its shape. It was watching her. Lily's throat closed. She could feel it, something, pressing down on her chest, trying to suffocate her with its presence. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but its shape seemed to tighten, like it was gathering itself, preparing to move. Lily's heart pounded in her ears as her hand reached for the door, ready to flee, but before she could turn the handle, the voice inside her head spoke again. "You should have never come back." The words were not a question, but a statement, and they carried with them an unbearable weight. Lily staggered, her legs buckling beneath her as she gasped for air. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, pressing in on her, choking her. The room seemed to close in, the walls warping and stretching, the corners darkening with something that shouldn't exist. She looked down at her hands, trembling, and when she looked up again, the figure was gone. But the whispers remained. They filled the air, suffocating, relentless. Lily stumbled toward the door, her mind racing, her body shaking with fear. She didn't know what was happening, but the house was alive, and it was feeding on her terror. She was beginning to understand. This place was no accident. It had been waiting for her, and it was not going to let her leave. Lily's mind was a blur as she stumbled out of the living room and into the hallway. She had to get out. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her chest tight with fear. The house felt like it was closing in around her, its walls pressing on her as she tried to push through them. Every step seemed to echo, each footfall too loud in the suffocating silence. The whispers had stopped, but they were still there, lingering beneath her skin, crawling under her thoughts, like tiny insects burrowing deeper into her mind. The air was heavy, thick with something dark, something that hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe decades. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, as if the house were watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Lily could feel it in every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls as they shifted under their own weight. This was no ordinary place. This was something older, something far more sinister. She pressed on, determined to find the exit. But when she reached the front door, she froze. The door was still wide open, the wind whistling outside. It beckoned her, promised escape. She reached for the doorknob, but her fingers hesitated just before touching the cold metal. Something inside her knew that leaving wasn't the answer. There was something unfinished here. Something she had to understand before she could go. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall behind her. Lily spun around, her heart pounding in her throat. Her eyes scanned the shadows, but no one was there. Still, she could feel it, the presence hovering just out of sight. The whispers returned, softer now, like a distant chant, but she couldn't make out the words. The air grew colder, the temperature in the house dropping noticeably. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. No reply. Her pulse quickened. The house seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Lily looked down the hallway again. The stairs beckoned her, their darkened steps seeming to lead deeper into the bowels of the house, where the secrets were buried. The whispers seemed to come from that direction now, soft, insistent, almost pleading. A flash of movement caught her eye, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. She turned away from the door. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Something was pulling her toward the stairs. Taking a deep breath, Lily forced herself forward, her feet moving almost of their own accord. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step sounding louder in the thick, oppressive silence. She could feel the eyes of the house on her, the unseen force that watched and waited. At the top of the stairs, the air grew colder and the whispers became clearer. Not words exactly, but a feeling, a sensation of something buried beneath the floorboards, something that had been locked away for years. She stopped in front of the first room on the left, the door half open. The room was dark, save for the faint sliver of moonlight that filtered through the window. The shadows seemed to curl and writhe within, as if alive, twisting in on themselves. Lily swallowed hard, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She knew she had to go inside. She stepped in cautiously, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. The room smelled of mildew and decay, and the air was thick, stale. There was something in here, something old, something forgotten. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its pattern barely visible under years of dust. The bed, like in the first room, was unmade, its sheets tangled and torn. Lily's eyes scanned the room, but it was the small, old desk in the corner that caught her attention. It was covered in dust, but there were small items scattered across its surface. Papers, old books, and what was that? Lily stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she reached for a small, framed photograph lying on the desk. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, her breath hitching when she saw the faces of the people in the picture. It was the same family, the same boy and girl. But this time there was more. The boy's face was clear, his eyes locked in a haunting, wide-eyed stare, as though caught in a moment of terror. And the girl, she was smiling. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of something else. Something wrong. Lily felt a chill snake up her spine. She placed the photograph down carefully, her hand shaking. But it wasn't just the photograph that unsettled her. It was the way the shadows in the room had begun to shift, flickering like the light of a candle in the wind. There was movement here, movement that shouldn't have been. A faint voice echoed in the room, soft but growing louder. Lily. Her name. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows where she had just seen that flicker of movement. Lily's breath caught in her throat and she spun around, her eyes searching the room. The shadows twisted, lengthening, stretching. Lily. The voice came again, more insistent this time, and as it did, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was the girl from the photograph. Her eyes were wide, her smile still fixed in place, but now her face was hollow, empty. Her skin was pale and her clothes were old, ragged, stained. She stepped forward, slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. Lily's heart stopped. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The girl's gaze fixed on her, and it was like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressed down on her chest. The girl raised a hand, pointing directly at her. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not human. They were something ancient, something that slithered like a snake in Lily's mind. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was inside her head now, drowning out everything else, filling her thoughts with a suffocating pressure. Lily stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall as she slid down to the floor. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The girl took another step forward, her hand still outstretched, her finger pointing accusingly at Lily. You were supposed to stay away. The room began to spin. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against her. The girl's figure wavered, distorting like a reflection in a broken mirror. Lily could hear it now, asterisk the whispering asterisk. Louder all around her, 1,000 voices all calling her name. Lily. And then everything went black. Lily awoke with a jolt, her eyes snapping open, heart hammering in her chest. She gasped for air, her breath sharp and shallow as if she had been drowning. For a moment, everything was disoriented, a blur of motion, of shadows stretching and twisting in the half-light. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus on the shapes around her, but it took her a few seconds to realize where she was. She was still in the room, the same room. The same photograph lay on the desk beside her, the boy and the girl staring back at her with their vacant eyes. But the girl wasn't smiling anymore. She was gone. Lily's gaze darted around the room, her body trembling. The shadows that had stretched toward her earlier were now still, as though frozen in time. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight that had hung over the house since she'd arrived. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, the very foundation of the place shifting beneath her feet. But there was something new now. A sound. Soft at first, almost imperceptible but growing louder with each passing second. Ticking. A clock. Lily turned her head, following the sound, her eyes narrowing as they fell on an old wooden grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It stood tall and dark, its face obscured by the shadow cast from the window. The tick-tock of the clock filled the air, so loud in the silence that it felt like it was vibrating through her bones. But when she looked closer, she saw something odd. The hands of the clock were moving backward, slowly, relentlessly. Her stomach churned. She rubbed her eyes, convinced that her mind was playing tricks on her, but when she opened them again, the hands were still moving in reverse. It's impossible, she thought. Clocks don't do that. But here it was, right before her eyes. The clock ticked backward with a strange, mechanical persistence, as though the hands were pushing against the flow of time itself. Lily stood there, frozen, mesmerized by the anomaly, unsure of what she was seeing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the clock stopped. The room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. The air seemed to grow heavier, as though the house itself had stopped breathing. Lily exhaled slowly, unsure whether the tension in her chest was from the air or from the rising dread she felt deep inside her. That was when she noticed the door. The door to the room was closed now. It hadn't been before. It had been ajar when she had first entered, but now it was fully shut, as though it had never been open in the first place. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the wooden surface, the cold iron handle glinting in the low light. What the hell is going on? She took a cautious step toward the door, but before she could reach for the handle, something strange happened. A sound, a creak, came from the other side of the room. Lily froze, her hand hovering in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as if someone, or something, was moving upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps echoed from above, and Lily's blood ran cold. The house wasn't empty. Someone was here. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind her, following her every move. Her muscles tensed as she slowly turned around, expecting to see something in the room with her. Nothing. But the room had changed. The shadows had deepened. The walls seemed to have shifted, narrowing, closing in on her. Her pulse quickened as she took a step back, her mind racing. She wasn't imagining this. The room had changed. It was the same but different. The house. Her breath hitched in her throat. The house wasn't just alive. It was aware of her. Lily's hand reached for her pocket, where she had left her phone earlier. But when she pulled it out, the screen was blank. No signal. No power. Nothing. It was as if the house had drained the life from it. Asterisk no. This isn't happening. This is all in my head. I'm just imagining things asterisk. But as she looked around the room, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows shifted again, and this time they weren't just shadows. They were shapes. Faint, almost imperceptible, like ghostly figures lingering just beyond the edge of her vision. Was she being haunted? Her pulse raced as she turned back toward the door, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't stay in here, couldn't let herself become trapped in this place. She needed to get out. But the door was still shut, still mocking her from the other side. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud bang from upstairs. The sound was so violent that it rattled the floorboards beneath her feet. Lily's body jerked, and she flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. A low, guttural voice followed, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was a whisper at first, but it grew louder, louder until it was more of a growl. Lily. Her name. The voice was unmistakable, but this time it wasn't just the girl from the photograph. It was something else, something darker, something far more sinister. Lily's body moved before she could even think about it. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she grasped it. The cold metal burned her skin as she turned it, but to her horror, the door didn't budge. It was locked. She rattled the knob, trying to force it open, panic rising in her chest. But no matter how hard she pulled, no matter how much she tried to push, the door refused to open. This isn't real. But it was. She could feel it in every inch of her body, the oppressive force of something evil pressing down on her. The growling continued from upstairs, louder now, and the sound of footsteps echoed once more, this time on the stairs. And then, as if to answer, the clock ticked again. Backwards. Her heart raced. The past is here. The door shuddered under her hand, the wood groaning as though it was alive. Something was on the other side. Lily's mind screamed for her to get out, to run, but her feet were frozen in place. Every instinct told her to flee, but the door, the house, held her there, kept her trapped in its grip. The footsteps grew closer, and the growling grew louder, filling the space with its dark, unnatural presence. The door rattled again, this time harder, as though something was pushing from the other side. And then the door opened. The door swung open with an eerie creak, as if the house itself were sighing in relief. Lily stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway beyond was cloaked in shadows, a darkness so thick it seemed to pulse, to breathe. She couldn't see the end of it, the hall stretching infinitely before her, an unbroken tunnel leading deeper into the heart of the house. A cold gust of wind swept past her, making her shiver. She hadn't felt it before, hadn't noticed the window or the open door, nothing. She had been too consumed by the fear of the unseen presence, by the dissonance that twisted everything around her. The sound of footsteps on the stairs had died down, replaced by a stillness that felt worse than any noise. Lily's hand trembled as it released the doorknob. She wasn't sure what she was expecting on the other side, but whatever it wasn't this. The house had been alive in its own right, but now it felt like something else was here, something that watched her. The smell of rot hit her first. A thick, musty odor that clung to the walls, the air, to everything. She gagged, instinctively stepping back into the room. But the door remained open, a yawning abyss that dared her to enter. And as much as she wanted to turn away, to run as far and as fast as she could, something was compelling her to take that first step. The wind stirred again, this time stronger, almost pushing her forward. Lily had no choice but to move. She crossed the threshold into the hallway, the door clicking softly behind her as if locking her in. The steps she took were tentative, careful, her feet shuffling across the old, creaky floorboards. Every step seemed to reverberate through the house, like a signal, as if it wanted her to know she was being watched. The air around her was unnaturally cold. It sunk deep into her skin, making her limbs stiff, the hairs on her neck rising in warning. Her breath came out in short bursts, visible in the freezing air. The darkness seemed to pull at her, coiling around her like something alive, something ancient. Lily forced herself to move forward. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn around, but something was tugging her further into the hallway, deeper into the house. The walls closed in as she walked. The narrow space felt impossibly small, the shadows gathering in every corner, pressing in on her. The sound of her footsteps was louder now, as though the house had somehow multiplied the noise, making it echo off every surface, reverberating in her skull. It wasn't until she reached the first doorway that something made her pause. A door at the end of the hallway stood ajar, the dim light from the room spilling out and casting long shadows into the corridor. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the eyes. At first, she thought she was seeing things, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. But as she focused, she realized what they were. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They dotted the walls like some kind of grotesque mosaic. Some were human, others not. There were eyes embedded in the wallpaper, staring at her from the cracks in the floor, peering through gaps in the wooden beams that supported the ceiling. They blinked at her, some narrowing, others widening with unsettling curiosity. Lily's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to turn and flee, but her body refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, her mind desperately trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She raised her hand to her mouth, stifling the urge to gasp. Her fingers shook, but she couldn't stop herself from reaching out, moving closer. Her legs felt like lead, and yet she forced herself forward, one slow step at a time. As she passed the eyes, the pressure in the air seemed to intensify. The weight of their gaze was unbearable. Every single one of them followed her as she moved down the hallway. It wasn't just the walls. The eyes were in the very fabric of the house itself. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out from somewhere ahead of her. Lily froze, her body tensing as the sound echoed through the space. A door slammed shut. She whipped around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The eyes on the wall seemed to shift. Some narrowed, others widened. She could have sworn they were moving, that they were blinking in rhythm with her heartbeat. The silence in the hallway was oppressive. But as she stood there, paralyzed by fear, she heard it again. A whisper. Lily? The voice was low, just barely audible over the pounding of her own blood in her ears. The sound came from ahead of her, from the dark room at the end of the hall. It was cold, familiar, an old voice, a voice from her past. Her knees wobbled as she took another step forward, each one feeling heavier than the last. She wasn't sure why she was moving, why she couldn't turn back, but she knew one thing. The house wanted her to go forward. The eyes were all watching her, and the whispers were drawing her in. She reached the doorway. It was barely cracked open, but as she neared, the door swung inward with a force that rattled the frame. She gasped, taking a hesitant step inside. The room was dim, bathed in an eerie, gray light. A large, four-poster bed sat in the center, draped with faded curtains. The wallpaper was peeling, curling away from the walls in long strips. And there, on the floor, scattered across the old wooden boards, were more eyes. Dozens, maybe hundreds, lying abandoned like broken mirrors. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped further into the room. She didn't want to be here, but she couldn't stop herself. The room felt alive with something darker than what she'd felt before, something colder. And then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, behind a faded armchair, something was moving. Something human. A figure stood there, its back to her, hunched over, the shadows swallowing its form. The air felt thick, like it was choking her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the figure turned slowly toward her. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black as coal, and her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. But it wasn't her expression that terrified Lily. It was the eyes. The same eyes that had followed her down the hall, the same eyes that had stared at her from the walls, now staring back at her from within the woman's face. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Lily. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream, raw and guttural, filling the room, forcing her to her knees. The eyes, those black, endless eyes, watched her, and she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. You should have never come back. Lily's legs buckled beneath her, and she crashed to her knees, gasping for breath, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The room was spinning, her vision blurred by the overwhelming pressure of the air around her. The woman, if she could even be called that, moved closer, each step slow and deliberate, her dark eyes fixed on Lily with an intensity that made the blood freeze in her veins. It's not real, Lily's mind screamed. Asterisk, this can't be happening. It can't, asterisk. But every instinct in her body screamed otherwise. The figure was getting closer, and as she neared, Lily's stomach twisted, her throat tight with the cold realization that whatever this thing was, it was not human. Her mouth was dry, her body trembling as if it had been submerged in ice water. Lily scrambled backward on her hands, but her eyes never left the figure. She could hear the sound of her own breath, frantic and sharp in the suffocating silence. The woman's lips twitched upward into that grin, unnatural, wide, grotesque. Her teeth were sharp, yellowed like the bones of something long dead, and her breath seemed to mist the air with a foul stench like rot. The stench of decay. The stench of death. It's just a nightmare, Lily thought desperately, trying to convince herself that any moment she would wake up, that this horror would vanish. But the woman kept coming, her long, skeletal fingers stretching toward Lily's face. Lily's pulse quickened as she slammed her hands down onto the floor to push herself backward, but the woman was already there, standing directly in front of her, blocking any path of escape. Lily looked up, her eyes locked with the woman's, no, with the thing's eyes, and a bone-chilling realization struck her like lightning. The woman wasn't just standing there. She was in the reflection of something behind Lily. A mirror. Lily's heart stopped as she turned her head. The large, cracked mirror above the bed reflected the room, except it was not the room she had just entered. In the mirror, the furniture was newer, the wallpaper pristine, and the woman in the reflection wasn't a grotesque, decayed thing. She was beautiful, wearing an elegant, long black dress, her face serene, her features soft and inviting. Lily's breath caught. There was a warmth in that reflection, a familiarity that made her feel safe. But the reflection wasn't just of the woman. In the mirror, Lily could see herself standing next to her, her posture stiff and uncertain, her face pale. It was her, but it wasn't. The woman in the reflection was touching Lily's shoulder, her fingers light, almost tender, as if guiding her somewhere. The thing behind her, the one in the room, stepped forward again, her breath ragged, her lips twisted into that same unnatural smile. Lily wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her fingers reached out toward the mirror as if drawn to it by some invisible force, and the reflection shifted, distorting, turning from calm to something dark and jagged. The air grew heavy with the scent of mildew, of decay, of death. The reflection of the woman grew fainter, her soft features blurring, her once serene expression now twisted into a mask of anger and pain. What is this? The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a doorway. Lily's heart pounded faster. The thing that had once been a woman was now pressing up against the mirror, her face shifting, changing. The warmth, the safety she had once felt in the glass, was gone. She could hear the woman's voice again, but it wasn't the same voice. It was fractured. You shouldn't have come back, it whispered louder now. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back to mean asterisk. Lily's skin prickled as the walls of the room seemed to close in on her, the darkness pressing tighter, forcing her toward the mirror. Her body moved without her consent, every inch of her mind screaming to stop, to run, but she couldn't. The woman in the reflection grinned wider, and Lily felt her body shaking, the sense of wrongness flooding her senses, drowning her in dread. She reached out again, almost involuntarily, her fingers brushing the glass of the mirror, and as she did, a cold, clammy hand grabbed her wrist. Lily gasped, her entire body jerking as the hand pulled her in, dragging her toward the mirror. Her breath was stolen from her as the room seemed to vanish around her, replaced by a cold, crushing emptiness. And then, with a force she couldn't resist, Lily was yanked forward. The mirror shattered. Glass exploded in every direction, falling around her like rain, slicing through the air. She screamed, her voice lost in the chaos of shattering glass and a rising, unnatural wind that howled through the room, ripping at her clothes and hair. When the last shard hit the ground, the room was silent again. The mirror was gone. Completely gone. The reflection had disappeared, and Lily was left standing in the center of the room, disoriented, breathing heavily, her chest tight. Her mind was spinning, confused, unsure of what had just happened. The woman was gone, but Lily could still feel her presence. The air was colder now, heavier. And then she heard it. A laugh. Soft, faint, but it was unmistakable. Lily whipped around, her eyes scanning the room in panic, but there was no one there. No sign of the woman, no presence standing in the shadows. The room felt different now. The walls seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting like some massive creature that was alive. The laughter came again, louder this time, almost mocking. Lily's legs trembled as she stumbled toward the door, her heart racing, every instinct telling her to leave, to get out before whatever had been unleashed fully emerged. But as she reached for the door, the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked. No. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the room, until it felt like it was all around her. The shadows deepened, the walls closing in. The floor beneath her feet started to vibrate with a low, ominous hum. And then, from the corner of her eye, something moved. A shape. A shadow. A figure in the dark. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her heart in her throat, and as she did, she saw them. Thousands of them. Eyes that blinked and stared, burning into her with their empty, unblinking gaze. They weren't in the walls this time. They were in the floor. The ceiling. In the air around her, swirling like a storm. Lily screamed as they closed in, the space around her darkening, her entire world reduced to eyes and darkness. The last thing she saw before the shadows swallowed her whole was the reflection of the woman in the broken pieces of the mirror on the floor, smiling. Lily's body jerked awake, her mind racing, her breath ragged as she shot upright in the bed, heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the air thick and suffocating, pressing down on her like a weight. She blinked, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but nothing made sense. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, the bed beneath her too soft, the blankets too warm. The air smelled faintly of dust and mildew, but it was different now, less suffocating, more familiar. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her mind, but her hands were shaking. Sweat clung to her skin, the remnants of whatever nightmare had gripped her still clinging to her. She could still hear the laughter, that mocking, cruel sound echoing in her ears. The eyes, the reflection, the woman, it all felt so real, as if she were still trapped inside the walls of that cursed house. But she wasn't. At least she didn't think she was. She turned her head, slowly scanning the room. It looked like a bedroom, but it wasn't the same one she had just been in. The walls were bare, the bed plain, and a single window let in the faintest hint of moonlight, casting long shadows across the room. Lily's pulse began to slow, the pounding in her chest quieting, but a feeling of unease gnawed at her stomach. She was still disoriented, unsure of how she had gotten here or what had happened to her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold wooden floor. The room was quiet, but that didn't bring her comfort. Silence in this house was worse than any noise. It felt like the calm before a storm. She was alone, she knew that, but it didn't feel like she was. It felt like something was watching her, waiting, lingering in the darkness just out of sight. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the small dresser across from her. The door to the hallway was ajar, and the faintest sliver of light from the corridor seeped through, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but as soon as her feet hit the floor, the whispers returned. Lily. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Her heart skipped a beat and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Lily, come find me. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It wasn't the woman from before, but the sound of it stirred something deep within her. Something buried, something old. The words seemed to resonate in her chest, vibrating deep within her ribs, filling her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. "Who's there?" Lily's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but the air in the room grew heavier, colder. The whispers became louder, more insistent, swirling around her, brushing against her skin like cold fingers. "Come find me, Lily. You're so close now, asterisk." She didn't want to follow. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to leave, to escape whatever this thing was. But her body moved on its own, as if the voice had planted a seed deep within her that now controlled her every motion. She didn't know why, but she couldn't resist. She took a tentative step toward the door. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped, the air turning ice cold. She could see her breath clouding in front of her, and the whispers, those endless, maddening whispers, grew louder, more desperate. "You're so close. You'll understand soon, asterisk." Lily's body shivered with the cold, but she pushed forward, her legs trembling as she made her way down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls seemed to close in on her with every step she took, the shadows stretching and warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The house was alive again, the same oppressive feeling wrapping around her, the same sense of being watched, being hunted. She could hear it now, the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the house. But there was no one there. No one except her. Lily's chest tightened as she walked, her heart beating erratically in her chest. She wanted to stop, to turn around, but the whispers were too loud now, too commanding. "Come find me, Lily. I'm waiting, asterisk." The footsteps continued, but they weren't getting closer. They were staying just out of reach, leading her deeper into the house, into its heart. As she passed another room, she glanced inside. It was small, but there was something strange about it. A single chair sat in the center, and a mirror, old and cracked, was mounted on the far wall. The glass was warped, rippling like water, but when she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. There was something in the mirror. It was her reflection, but distorted, twisted. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but something in the reflection wasn't right. Her lips were moving, but the words didn't match her mouth. "It's too late, Lily. You can't escape, asterisk." The voice was sharp, cold, like ice in her veins. The words weren't her own, and yet they came from her reflection, from the twisted version of herself that stared back with hollow eyes. Lily recoiled, stumbling backward, but the mirror seemed to pulse, the reflection warping and stretching, reaching toward her. "You're mine now." The voice was louder, the words biting into her like a physical force. Her breath quickened, and she turned away from the mirror, her mind reeling, her body shaking with panic. No. She spun around and continued down the hallway, but the whispers were growing more frantic now, echoing off the walls, a cacophony of voices, all calling her name. "Lily, come closer." Something was pulling at her from the shadows, a force stronger than anything she could understand. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and as she neared the end of the hall, the door to a room that had been hidden in the darkness creaked open, just enough to let a sliver of light spill into the hallway. Lily couldn't stop herself. She stepped forward, drawn to it by some unseen hand, her pulse racing, her body moving faster than her thoughts could keep up with. Inside, the room was empty. At least it appeared empty at first. The walls were bare, save for strange, indecipherable symbols carved into the wood. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something on the floor, a blackened shape. A body. It was a person, but the features were unrecognizable, their face obscured by a dark, twisted stain. Lily's stomach turned as she knelt beside it, her hand hovering over the body, afraid to touch it but drawn in by some unholy curiosity. The whispers in her ears grew louder, more frantic, drowning out everything else. "It's time, Lily. Time to see the truth, asterisk." She reached out with trembling fingers. And then the body turned, its eyes snapping open. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as the body's eyes opened. They weren't eyes at all. They were black holes, empty voids that seemed to suck in the very light around them. Her heart pounded against her chest, each beat a drum of terror. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as they hovered above the body, paralyzed in fear. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her breathing, harsh and shallow. The whispers, those maddening whispers, faded for the briefest of moments, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Then the body moved. The lifeless form jerked, the limbs twitching violently, and Lily recoiled, stumbling back as the dead thing's mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. A smile that was no longer human, but something more sinister, something ancient and hungry. You shouldn't have come back. The voice wasn't the same. It was deeper, older, its tone gravelly like the earth itself. It crawled inside her mind, burrowing into her thoughts, and Lily's knees buckled beneath her as a wave of nausea washed over her. I've been waiting for you, waiting a long time. The body's hands moved slowly, unnaturally, fingers curling toward her, and Lily instinctively scooted backward, her feet scrambling for traction on the cold wooden floor. The room seemed to stretch, the walls pushing in on her, making the space feel impossibly small. Lily's chest tightened, her throat closing as she fought for air, her mind reeling. What is this, she thought? What is happening to me? She glanced at the door, but the hallway outside was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness, stretching beyond sight, swallowing up the light. You were always meant to find me. The voice whispered again, and Lily's eyes snapped back to the body, its form now more solid than before. It was as though the shadows themselves had given it life, wrapping around it like a second skin. The air grew thicker, colder, and the temperature dropped until she could see her breath fogging in the oppressive stillness. You're the key, Lily. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what the thing meant, but a sense of foreboding gripped her, squeezing her chest until she thought it would burst. Her body screamed for her to run, to escape this nightmare, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as though the shadows had pinned her in place, rooting her to the spot. The body sat up now, its movements stiff, jerky, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Its hollow eyes, those voids, locked onto hers, piercing her soul. It was no longer just a corpse. It was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something that had waited for this moment. You're not real, Lily whispered to herself, though her voice trembled with doubt. You can't be real. The thing's lips twisted into another grin, and it laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Oh, but I am, it whispered, its voice like the rasping of dry leaves. Asterisk, I've always been real. Waiting. Watching. Feeding off your fear, asterisk. Lily scrambled to her feet, adrenaline flooding her system, and she lunged for the door. But as her hand reached for the handle, it suddenly slammed shut with a force so violent it rattled the walls. She gasped in shock, her pulse racing as she turned back toward the room. The body was standing now, its legs moving as if they were newly formed, its gait erratic, unnatural. It took one step forward, then another, dragging its feet like a marionette on invisible strings. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any escape, any sign of help. The walls creaked and groaned as if the house itself was alive, shifting and moving around her. The floorboards buckled beneath her, splintering as if something deep within the house was stirring, something ancient and hungry. There is no escape, the body whispered, its voice growing louder, filling the room. Asterisk, this place has claimed you. This place has always claimed you, asterisk. Lily shook her head, her mind reeling with confusion. She couldn't make sense of it. Nothing made sense. What do you want from me? The body stopped in front of her, its hand reaching out with deliberate slowness. Lily tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles were frozen, her limbs refusing to respond. I want you to understand, the body said, its lips curling into something far worse than a smile, something that resembled a twisted, gnashing snarl. I want you to see what you've done. Lily's eyes widened as the thing's fingers brushed her cheek, cold as death itself. She shuddered, but the touch was gentle, almost soothing. Her skin crawled in response, as though it were being violated by the very essence of the thing. Suddenly, the room around her shifted. The walls rippled like water, and Lily's vision blurred, distorting the space in a dizzying whirl. She gasped, clutching at her head as a flood of images burst into her mind, flashes of a past long buried. Faces, voices, places, too many to comprehend, too many to process. And then it all clicked. Her family, her father, her mother, the house. The house, it's been in my blood. Lily's heart skipped a beat as the realization tore through her. Asterisk, this place isn't just haunted. It's connected to me, to my family, asterisk. The thing, the twisted body before her, laughed again, the sound reverberating in the room. Asterisk, you see now, don't you? You're the last of us. The last to remember. The last to carry the curse, asterisk. The words sank into her like poison. Her stomach churned as the truth, the horrible, horrifying truth, settled into her bones. Oh, Lily couldn't even form the words, her mind too overwhelmed by the weight of it all. You're my mother, the thing finished for her, its voice dripping with malice. Asterisk, I was once your mother, child. And now, I am everything that remains. Everything you left behind, asterisk. The house trembled, the walls shaking as though the very foundation of reality itself was cracking. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling her mind with images of things long forgotten. Rituals, dark rites performed in the dead of night. And then, the faces. No, Lily screamed, falling to her knees as her mind was overwhelmed. I didn't. You did, the body replied coldly. Asterisk, you brought me back. You opened the door. And now, there's no going back, asterisk. Lily's chest tightened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in all these years. Fear. True, unrelenting fear. The whispers crescendoed, and the house seemed to close in on her, the walls, the floor, the very air wrapping around her like a noose. The last thing Lily saw before everything went black was the figure of her mother, twisted and dark, reaching out to her with open arms. Lily awoke, but not in the way she expected. The first thing she noticed was the silence, an oppressive, suffocating stillness that hung in the air like a thick fog. It was unlike any silence she'd ever encountered. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was as though the world had held its breath, waiting for something. For her. Her eyes fluttered open, but it was dark. Darker than before. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, like a space between spaces. A room that seemed to have no beginning or end, the walls breathing softly, pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth, the kind of smell you'd find in a forgotten cellar. The floor beneath her was hard, uneven stone, and when she tried to move, her body felt strangely heavy, like she was trapped in a foggy dream. Lily's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, but she couldn't remember why. Why she was here, why she had woken up in this suffocating darkness. And then, like a sudden flood, it came rushing back. The body, the whispers, the terrible truth she had uncovered in the shadow of the house. Her mother. The thing that had once been her mother. The realization still gnawed at her, but there was no time to linger on it. She needed to move. Her legs felt weak, her limbs stiff and unresponsive, but she managed to push herself to her feet, leaning against the cold stone wall for support. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the cold seeping into her bones, but she didn't dare take a breath too deep. Her chest tightened with the thought of what might be in the air. A soft scraping sound echoed in the distance, a low, unsettling noise that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, that reminded you that the world was not as safe as it seemed, that underneath the surface, something was always watching, always waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she didn't know where to go. The sound grew louder, the scraping shifting to a faint tapping as if someone, or something, was knocking from far below. The walls around her seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as though the house itself was alive, and whatever it was beneath the earth, beneath the stones, was stirring. Slowly. Relentlessly. Lily's heart pounded, her breath catching in her throat as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. At first, it was subtle. A flicker, a small distortion in the air, like the faintest ripple across a still pond. But as she watched, it grew more pronounced. The shadows stretched and swirled as though something was coming through them, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The tapping continued, growing faster, more insistent, until it sounded like 1,000 tiny hands knocking at the walls from the other side. Lily's knees nearly buckled, and her hands trembled as she reached for the nearest thing to steady herself. A large, cracked mirror mounted on the wall in front of her. It was covered in grime, dust coating the glass, but Lily's reflection was still visible. At first, it was only her face, pale, wide-eyed with fear. But then, as she watched, the reflection seemed to twist, to distort, until the figure staring back at her was no longer just her own. Her mother's face appeared, twisted, skeletal, eyes hollow and dark, grinning at her with a mouth that was far too wide, too unnatural. The figure in the mirror reached out toward her, its hands scraping against the glass with an awful screech. Lily backed away in horror, but her reflection didn't move with her. It stayed, its grin widening, stretching, as though it were trying to break free from the mirror. The sound of the knocking grew louder, more frantic. Knock, 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 but now there was something else beneath it. A voice, faint at first, but growing clearer. Lily. It was the same voice from before, the one that had whispered in her mind, cold and menacing. It was coming from behind the walls, from beneath the earth. Asterisk, come closer, Lily. Come see what lies beneath, asterisk. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the cold deepened, wrapping itself around her like a vice. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she could swear she felt something brushing against her skin, something cold and clammy. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Her breath quickened, and she began to pace, moving away from the mirror, her thoughts spinning in chaos. She couldn't understand it, couldn't grasp how it all fit together. Her mother, the house, the curse. It was all connected, but the pieces refused to align. She needed answers. She needed to know what was happening, why this place had chosen her. Why now? The tapping from below continued, faster now, echoing through the walls in a rhythm that made her stomach turn. It wasn't just a sound, it was a call. The summons. Lily, come down. The voice was closer now, more distinct, as though it were right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Empty, save for the darkness and the silence. But the door, the one that she hadn't noticed before, was now ajar. A cold draft slipped through the gap, carrying with it the faintest scent of something foul. Lily's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she considered running, but the fear that had gripped her all this time, was stronger now, and she knew she couldn't leave. Not without answers. Her hand shook as she reached for the door, but before she could touch the handle, the voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. Lily. Without thinking, she stepped forward. Her breath caught in her throat as she passed through the doorway, the temperature plummeting as if she had just crossed into another world. The walls here were different, damp, ancient stone, as if they had been untouched for centuries. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and Lily could hear it now, the faint whisper of something stirring beneath the floor. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, cracked, the stones worn with age. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of what lay beneath, what had been hidden for so long. And the deeper she moved, the louder the knocking became. Lily. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. You were never meant to leave. The knocking grew into pounding, relentless, as if something deep below was trying to break through, trying to reach her. Lily froze, her blood running cold as the ground beneath her feet trembled. A deep rumble filled the air, and before she could react, the earth cracked open. And from the darkness below, something reached for her. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the ground shook beneath her. The sound was deafening, like thunder, only closer, much closer. The stone floor cracked open with a sickening sound, a jagged line running across the earth, and Lily stumbled back, barely managing to keep her footing. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The darkness below seemed to pulse, alive with something that could not be described with words. She saw it then, through the widening crack in the floor, the faintest glow, an unnatural greenish hue that seemed to radiate from the depths. The glow flickered, almost as if it were breathing, exhaling like the very soul of the earth. The air grew colder, impossibly cold. It bit at her skin, her clothes, sinking through to her bones. Lily's feet were frozen in place, the tremors beneath her feet too violent for her to move. She reached for the wall, her fingers scraping against the rough surface as she tried to steady herself, her eyes wide with terror. A noise echoed from the crack. A faint, scraping sound that made her stomach lurch. It was as though something was slithering, something large and heavy, moving slowly, deliberately toward the surface. Lily. The voice came again, stronger this time, ringing in her ears like a bell, its tone deep and familiar. She shuddered, the cold sinking deeper into her skin. Come down to me. Lily's pulse quickened. It wasn't her mother's voice this time. It was something older, something much darker. The voice seemed to wrap itself around her mind, a cold thread weaving through her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the terror. She could feel it, whatever it was, pressing on her from all sides, closing in, suffocating her. She turned, her eyes darting around the room. The stone walls seemed to close in on her, each pulse of the earth beneath her feet making the walls groan as though they were alive, as though they too were part of the dark force waiting below. Her skin crawled, and the pit of her stomach twisted painfully as she took an unsteady step backward. Then the whispering started again. Come closer, Lily. It was everywhere now, a chorus of voices. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the air thickened. The walls, once solid and unmoving, now seemed to shift, bending and warping. The shadows stretched toward her like tendrils, curling and reaching, and as she moved further back, they followed her every step. The very air seemed to warp around her, bending and twisting as the house itself reached out, trying to trap her in its grip. It's not real, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. It's not real. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. It was real. All of it. The house, the whispers, the shadow that had taken her mother. The past that had haunted her for years had finally come to claim her. She turned, looking for an exit, but there was no way out. The door was gone, vanished into the stone wall as if it had never existed. The room felt smaller now, the space closing in on her as the temperature plummeted. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow, deeper than the darkness itself, emerging from the crack in the floor. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible but growing clearer with each passing moment. It was a thing made of darkness, of shadows, stretching upward until it towered over her, reaching for the ceiling. Its shape was distorted, fluid, never quite the same from one moment to the next. The air vibrated with a hum, a low and unnatural sound that seemed to resonate from the very walls themselves. And as the shadow drew closer, it took on a more distinct form, a long, twisted figure draped in shadows, with eyes that glowed like coals, burning with a hunger that could not be satisfied. Lily's heart stopped. She knew this figure. She had seen it before. In her dreams, in her nightmares. But this was no dream. It was real. The thing reached out, its long clawed fingers brushing against the ground as it crept closer, its eyes locking onto hers. She could feel its gaze, cold, unyielding, and hungry. Her body froze as it loomed over her, the darkness wrapping itself around her like a shroud, choking the air from her lungs. "You can never leave," it whispered, the voice rumbling from its throat like thunder. Lily tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, her chest too tight to draw a breath. The darkness surrounded her, squeezing her, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her, crushing her from all sides. "This is your fate," the thing continued, its voice echoing inside her skull. "You were always meant to come back." Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, the world spinning around her. Her hands scraped against the cold stone as she tried to crawl, to escape, but the darkness was everywhere now. It had seeped into her skin, into her mind, and there was no escaping it. A flash of light caught her eye, flickering, faint, but unmistakable. Her heart raced as she turned toward it, a desperate hope rising in her chest. The light was coming from the crack in the floor, the same greenish glow that had pulsed earlier. It was stronger now, brighter, almost tangible. The thing, the shadow, stopped moving. Its burning eyes flickered toward the glow, and Lily saw her chance. Her breath coming in ragged gasps, she reached for the crack, her fingers trembling as she pressed them into the stone. The glow seemed to call to her, pulling her forward, urging her to come closer. "No, Lily," the shadow hissed, its voice filled with fury. "You are mine." But Lily couldn't stop. The light was all she had left, the only thing that made sense in the chaos. She could feel it pulling her, guiding her, as though it held the answers to everything. The answers to the questions that had haunted her since she stepped foot in this house. She reached the crack, her fingers brushing the surface, and as they made contact, the world seemed to shudder. The glow intensified, and a wave of energy rushed through her, blasting away the darkness, pushing it back. The cold receded, and for a moment, the room was bathed in a warm light. But just as quickly as it had come, the light flickered out. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight of the darkness returning. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she turned back to the shadow. It was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. But the air still felt wrong. The temperature was still low, the hum still thrumming in her ears. And she knew, deep down she knew, that the house wasn't finished with her. Not yet. "You will never escape," the voice whispered one last time, fading into the silence. And for the first time since she had arrived, Lily understood. The house was alive, and it would never let her go. Lily's legs shook beneath her as she tried to stand, her fingers still trembling from the touch of the crack in the floor. The silence that followed the fading of the shadow was deafening, and yet, beneath it, there was something else, a low, thrumming pulse like a heartbeat. The walls seemed to reverberate with it, vibrating ever so slightly, as though the very foundation of the house was alive. For a moment she didn't know what to do. The air felt thick, the oppressive weight of the house pressing in from every side, but there was nothing left to fight. She had to escape, she had to leave. But her mind wouldn't let go of the awful realization that the house had already claimed her, already wrapped its fingers around her soul. A low whisper, faint but persistent, brushed against the back of her mind. "Come back." Lily gasped, her heart jumping in her chest as the voice crawled from the darkness again, slithering like something crawling under her skin. She recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. Her surroundings were still, the stone walls, the damp, the eerie greenish glow that seemed to flicker in the cracks of the floor, pulsing with some unspeakable energy. The voice didn't relent. "You can't leave." Lily's breath became shallow, panicked as she backed toward the wall. Her skin was crawling, a cold sweat soaking through her clothes as she tried to find any path out of the room, any way to escape. But the walls were closing in, shrinking around her, the air growing colder by the second. The house was no longer just a building, it was a living thing, and it had made its decision. She had come too close to the truth. She had uncovered what should have remained buried. "You are a part of this place now." The whisper seemed to echo, rising and falling with each passing moment, until it was all-consuming, all-encompassing. There was no escape from it, no way to drown out the voice that was now her only companion. Her mind flashed to the mirror, the reflection of her mother's twisted, grotesque form. That horrifying vision had burned itself into her memory. But that was not all. She remembered the body, the dark secret of the house, the symbols that twisted and warped like memories she could barely understand. "What do you want from me?" The words came from her mouth before she could stop them, a pleading cry that seemed so small against the vast, oppressive presence that surrounded her. But there was no answer. Not immediately. Then, as if responding to her desperation, the house groaned, a low, guttural sound coming from deep within its bowels. The floor beneath her feet rumbled, and Lily staggered back, her eyes wide in terror as the very ground seemed to shift. The crack in the floor grew wider, the greenish glow intensifying, until it looked like a portal to another world, a hole into the depths of something far darker than she had ever imagined. "Come closer, Lily." She didn't want to. She couldn't. The very thought of it made her stomach churn with dread, but her body, her mind, they were both rebelling against her. She could feel it, a tug like something invisible was pulling her toward the crack. The voice wasn't just in her ears anymore. It was inside her, speaking to her in the deepest part of her consciousness, where her darkest fears lived. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the feeling of being drawn, being pulled, was undeniable. A sense of inevitability wrapped itself around her, chaining her to the place, to the house. The darkness beneath the floor had opened up, and it was calling her back. "You know what lies below, Lily." The whisper was almost comforting now, as if it understood her, as if it had always known her. "It is waiting for you." Lily's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her fingers grazing the edge of the crack. She felt a chill spread through her, like icy fingers tracing the line of her spine, and for a moment she could hear it, a distant echoing sound like the rattle of chains in a forgotten dungeon, a heavy, oppressive sound that vibrated in her bones. The air grew thicker, colder. Her breath misted in front of her, and she realized with sickening clarity that she was no longer alone. Something had risen from the depths. The creature was already here. It slithered across the stone floor, its form half hidden in the shadows, but Lily could see it now. It was a thing of nightmare, all sharp angles and contorted shapes, its body stretching in unnatural ways. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was as black as the void, slick and wet, shimmering with an oily sheen. Its eyes, two glowing orbs of fiery red, fixed on her, burning into her soul with an unrelenting intensity. "You should never have come back," it whispered, its voice a hissing hiss, a sound that made her insides writhe with terror. "You should never have left." Her breath was caught in her throat. Her body refused to move, frozen with fear as the creature crawled closer, its limbs contorting, twisting in ways that made no sense, pulling itself toward her with impossible speed. She tried to scream. She tried to push herself up, to run, but her legs were leaden, her muscles unresponsive. The creature's form seemed to grow as it neared her, stretching toward her, the red eyes widening, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, stained with something she couldn't name. "You are mine now," it growled. "Forever." The room darkened further, the shadows seeming to deepen around her. She could feel the walls closing in, the air thickening, suffocating her. The creature reached out, its long clawed fingers brushing against her cheek, and she could feel its cold touch, colder than anything she had ever experienced. Lily wanted to close her eyes, to shut it all out, but she couldn't. Her body was frozen, trapped, and the creature's voice was everywhere now, inside her mind, curling around her thoughts like smoke. "You cannot escape what you are." Her eyes flicked back to the crack in the floor. It was still there, still glowing, and a part of her, a sick, twisted part of her, knew that the creature would drag her down into the depths. She had seen it before. The house had taken her mother, and now it wanted her. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would complete the curse. The house had claimed them both, and there would be no escape. The creature's fingers lingered on her skin, cold as death itself. Its touch sent a tremor through her body, deep and primal, as if her very essence was being drained. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she would collapse, fall into the blackness that surrounded her. But something inside her snapped. It wasn't bravery and it wasn't hope. It was desperation. The creature's voice reverberated in her mind, filling every corner with its twisted, mocking tone. "You think you can fight it?" Lily's hand reached instinctively for the stone beneath her, her fingers brushing against the rough surface of the floor. Her body was shaking, her mind racing, and her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. Every nerve screamed for her to move, to escape, to get away from this abomination that towered over her. But she was trapped. The room seemed to bend around her, the walls pressing in, the shadows twisting and curling as if they were alive. The greenish glow from the crack in the floor pulsed, drawing her in, beckoning her to come closer, to surrender to the thing that had waited for her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sight of the creature that loomed above her. Her fingers, still touching the floor, began to feel something beneath the stone. A tremor ran through her hand. It wasn't just the pulse of the house. No, it was something else, something solid, something old, something buried. A sudden flash of memory hit her, a memory from her childhood, one she had locked away. A memory of her mother, her warnings, her eyes full of fear and sorrow. Asterisk, it's not the house you're fighting, Lily. It's the curse. You must never return, asterisk. The words echoed in her mind, sharp as a knife, and for the first time Lily understood. The house was not just a place. It was a prison. A prison that had been waiting for her. And the creature, it wasn't just a manifestation of evil. It was the embodiment of everything the house had been. It had claimed her mother, and now it would claim her. But there was one thing Lily hadn't realized. One thing she had overlooked in all of this fear, in all of her attempts to escape. She was part of this place, yes, but so was her mother. The memory, her mother's desperate plea, flashed again. It wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding the truth that the house had buried. The curse that had taken her mother was not an accident. It was a pattern, a never-ending cycle. And Lily was the key. The floor beneath her trembled again, the crack widening, pulling the air from her lungs. Her head spun. The creature's eyes burned with a hungry fire, and it seemed to sense her realization. Asterisk, you think you understand? You think you've figured it out? Asterisk. The voice rumbled, deeper, closer now. The claws scraped the stone, the sound filling her ears, but Lily didn't flinch. She held on to that memory, that truth. She wasn't just the victim here. She was the one who could break the cycle. Her heart pounded as she lifted her hand to the crack. The ground pulsed beneath her fingertips. She could feel it. This was where it all began. The house, the curse, the darkness. It was all centered here in this very spot. The force that had fed on her family, on generations of souls lost to the house. She was the one who had to stop it. But how? How could she fight something that was so ancient, so relentless? The answer was right in front of her. She had been running from it all this time. Running from the truth. But now she would face it. It's not just about escaping, she whispered to herself, her voice shaking but growing stronger. It's about destroying it. The glow from the crack intensified, the greenish light seeping into her skin, into her very bones. The walls seemed to breathe, their pulse in rhythm with the creature's own. But Lily didn't back down. She pressed her hand against the crack, her fingers brushing against the edge of something cold, something sharp. She felt the weight of it, the weight of the curse that had been buried for so long. With a final surge of will, Lily pushed. She pushed through the fear, through the darkness, through the suffocating weight of the house. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the ground shifted beneath her, as if the house itself was resisting her. And then, just as she thought she would be swallowed whole, the world went still. The creature's growls faded into silence. The walls ceased their groaning. The pulse of the house stopped, as if the beating heart of the darkness had been torn from its chest. Lily opened her eyes. The room had changed. The shadows were no longer twisting around her. The oppressive weight had lifted. The greenish glow that had once filled the room was gone. The air was still cold, but it was no longer suffocating. The oppressive feeling had vanished, replaced by a quiet, unsettling emptiness. Lily's pulse raced in her ears. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and her body trembled with exhaustion. She had done it. She had ended it. Or had she? Her gaze shifted toward the crack in the floor. It was sealed. The creature was gone. But there was something else there, something faintly shimmering as if the very fabric of reality had been altered. The truth, the heart of the house, was no longer hidden. She had broken the cycle for now. But that didn't mean the house was finished with her. Lily didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the cracked floor, the silence stretching around her. It could have been minutes, could have been hours. The time no longer mattered. Her mother's warnings rang in her head. You must never return. The house may have been quiet for now, but Lily knew it wasn't over. She knew that whatever had been released, that pulse, that darkness, was never truly gone. The house had a life of its own, and it would wait just as it always had. Her body shook with the weight of it. She had escaped. But she couldn't stay here any longer. With a final glance at the room that had become her prison, Lily turned toward the door. The house would always be there waiting, but so would she, watching ready. The cycle had broken for now, but a part of her knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The house wasn't done with her yet. Story 3. The wind howled through the trees, shaking their gnarled branches as they scraped against the walls of the house like the claws of some unseen predator. Outside, the storm raged, thick sheets of rain battering the windows, and the occasional crack of thunder sending shockwaves through the hollow landscape. The house stood alone as it had for decades, nestled deep in the woods near Hollow Creek, miles away from any town or living soul. An old, decaying mansion, its white paint chipped away by time and neglect, and its once beautiful windows now half broken, like the eyes of a long-forgotten corpse. Inside, the air felt thick, damp, and oppressive, almost as if it was waiting for something to happen. Samantha Jones stood just inside the threshold, a lone figure in the darkened entryway, her shoes squeaking on the rotting wooden floors. She wiped her damp hands on her jeans, nervously glancing around. The house was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. Her breath came out in small, visible puffs. She wasn't sure what had brought her here. Maybe it was the promise of escape, or maybe she just needed to run from the remnants of her life. Either way, it didn't matter now. The door had closed behind her, and she was here, alone. There were no other choices. She had been driving for hours, trying to outrun the memory of the life she left behind. Her failed marriage, the quiet guilt of a motherless child, the pull of a past she couldn't outrun. A crumpled letter in her pocket had promised peace, a place to rest her thoughts. Come to Hollow Creek. Stay at the house. Find what you're looking for. Simple. Straightforward. It sounded like what she needed. The house was abandoned, or so the letter had said. But it didn't look abandoned. There was something in the air, something that made her skin crawl. The house felt alive, as though it had been waiting for her. A flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, casting long shadows along the walls. Samantha flinched, her heart skipping a beat. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the feeling of unease creeping up her spine. But it wasn't just the storm that made her feel this way, it was something about the house itself, something older than the storm. Something ancient, just out of reach. She walked further in, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The hallway stretched before her, dark and narrow. At the end, an open door led into a large room. She could see faint flickers of candlelight, odd for a house so old, yet there they were, dancing across the walls. Samantha stepped forward, the sound of the floorboards groaning under her weight. The flickering light grew brighter as she moved, until she stood at the threshold of the room. It was a parlor, or at least it had been once. Now it was a place of decay, cracked, yellowing wallpaper peeling off the walls, a large fireplace with blackened stone, and furniture draped in dusty sheets. But it was the candles that caught her attention. They were arranged in a circle on the floor, their flickering flames casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. In the center of the circle was an old wooden box, its surface worn and cracked. The air around it felt thick, almost like it was breathing. A wave of dread rolled over Samantha, but curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. She wanted to know what it was. Needed to know. As she stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound of wood against wood like a gunshot in the quiet darkness. Her heart raced. She turned, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house had locked her in. But it wasn't the door that made her blood run cold. It was the whisper. Low, faint, and unintelligible at first, but growing clearer, louder. Samantha froze, her breath caught in her throat. The whisper was coming from the box, and it was calling her name. Samantha. Her hand shook as she reached for the box. Her fingers brushed against the rough wood, and the whisper stopped. Just like that. For a moment, the world felt still, too still. The storm outside had quieted, and even the flickering candles seemed to settle. But as she lifted the lid of the box, she felt something else shift, deep within the house. The silence was broken by a creak above her. Heavy footsteps. They were coming. Her heart pounded and her stomach churned. She dropped the lid and spun around. The room was empty, but the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She wasn't alone. The whispers returned, only this time they were louder, more insistent, all around her, surrounding her. The candles flickered wildly, casting the shadows into jagged, grotesque shapes that danced across the walls. The footsteps were deafening now, and she could feel the floor beneath her feet vibrating, as though something heavy was moving toward her. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Samantha. Her name echoed in the darkness, a cry from the past, a warning, a memory long buried. And then everything went black. The smell of mildew and wet wood filled her nostrils as Samantha slowly regained consciousness. Her head throbbed and her throat was dry, like she had been screaming for hours. She blinked, trying to clear the fog from her mind. Her body ached and she was disoriented. She couldn't remember how she had ended up on the floor of the parlor, her back pressed against the cold, damp wall. The room was different now. The circle of candles was gone and the box, whatever it had been, was nowhere to be found. But the feeling remained. The feeling that something was watching her. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with the heavy weight of something lurking just out of sight. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now, as though they were waiting for her to turn her back. And then she heard it again, the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and far too close. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. "Who's there?" Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. But the answer was only more footsteps, echoing down the hall. She jumped to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps were getting closer, louder, as though the very walls were closing in on her. Panic surged through her body, but she forced herself to stay still, to listen. The sound wasn't coming from the hall. It was coming from above. A creaking, a slow, rhythmic tread, like someone pacing, dragging their feet across the floorboards of the upper floor. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. Samantha stepped back, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, a way out. But the windows were boarded up. The door was still locked. She was trapped. The pacing above her continued, each step deliberate, echoing through the empty house. She bit her lip, trying to steady her breathing, but it wasn't working. Every time her chest expanded, it felt like something was pressing down on her, suffocating her. A sudden noise from the far end of the room snapped her back into focus. A small, old chair, one of the few pieces of furniture left in the parlor, creaked. Slowly, agonizingly, it moved as though something invisible had just pushed it. Samantha turned toward it, her heart leaping into her throat. There was no wind. There were no open windows. There was nothing that could explain it. The chair slid a few inches, then stopped. Samantha blinked rapidly, unsure of what she had just seen. Maybe it was just the old house settling, maybe the storm had unsettled her more than she realized. But deep down she knew. She knew that whatever was in this house, whatever was waiting, was not something natural. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard a soft, guttural whisper in the air, brushing against her ear like a cold wind. "Samantha." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned toward the source of the voice, her eyes scanning the room. But there was nothing except the oppressive darkness. But the whisper persisted, louder this time. "Samantha." Samantha staggered backward, her pulse racing. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was as if the very walls of the house were alive, murmuring to her, taunting her. Each step she took toward the door, the air seemed to grow heavier. The footsteps above her ceased, and in their place, a faint sound began to echo, so faint, it was almost imperceptible. A child's laugh. Soft, hollow, distant. Her knees went weak. The laugh was too familiar. She could feel it, deep inside her, like a splinter of memory she couldn't quite grasp. But when she tried to push it to the forefront of her mind, it slipped away like water through her fingers. She staggered forward, desperate to escape, to find something, anything, that would break the suffocating tension in the air. As she neared the door, the wood beneath her feet groaned and the temperature plummeted. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling. But the knob didn't turn. She tugged again. Nothing. The shadows in the room thickened, swirling around her, pushing in from every direction, like an invisible force pulling her deeper into the house. The whispers turned into murmurs, unintelligible and maddening, but still unmistakably present, surrounding her as though the walls themselves were speaking her name. Suddenly, the air became oppressive, suffocating, and the temperature dropped so drastically that she could see her breath in front of her. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder and louder, until it seemed like the whole house was vibrating with the rhythm. And then the door opened. Not with a creak or a groan, but with a slow, deliberate pull, as though something, or someone, had let it open for her. Samantha stepped back, her breath ragged. She didn't know what to expect, but the doorway revealed nothing but a dark, narrow hallway. A hallway she hadn't noticed before, tucked away in the far corner of the parlor. She didn't want to go there. She wanted to leave, to run. But something, some force deep inside her, made her move toward it. She felt the pull, the compulsion, like invisible fingers tugging her forward. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her down the hallway. The moment she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further, and the house seemed to groan in protest as though it were waking up, shifting, stretching. The shadows seemed to gather, swirling around her in erratic patterns, twisting as though they were alive. At the end of the hall, she saw a door. It was different from the others. It was old, worn, and heavy. A rusted iron doorknob glinted in the dim light, but it wasn't the door that caught her attention. It was what was behind it. Faint, flickering light. Not from candles. A fire. A fire that didn't belong in a house this old. Samantha hesitated. 1,000 warnings screamed at her, urging her to turn back, to leave the house before it consumed her whole. But something kept her moving, something she couldn't shake. And just as she reached for the handle, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow and labored, coming from behind her. It was close. Too close. She spun around, her pulse skipping, her body frozen with fear. The hallway behind her was empty, but the presence was there. She could feel it. Closer. Closer. And then the door creaked open on its own. The light beckoned her forward. But something else was waiting. Something far worse than the house. Something far older. Samantha stepped forward. The air grew heavier with each step Samantha took toward the door. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of history, the weight of something watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her body was moving forward anyway, against her will, as if something beyond her understanding was pulling her toward the light. She reached the door, the rusted iron doorknob cold under her trembling fingers. She hesitated for just a moment, the soft sound of her breath mingling with the crackling of distant flames. What was behind this door? Her skin prickled with a sensation she couldn't place, as if the house itself was holding its breath, anticipating what she would do next. With a deep, shaky breath, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small room bathed in an eerie orange glow. The room was old, dusty and neglected, but it wasn't completely abandoned. It was as if someone or something had been here recently. The walls were covered in thick, curling tapestries, faded with age. In the center of the room stood a large stone hearth, and the fire crackling inside cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. But the fire wasn't normal. It burned with an unnatural intensity, as though it had been fed by something other than wood. The flames seemed to dance and twist in ways that defied nature, flickering with a strange greenish hue at times, then bursting into blinding white light, only to return to their eerie orange glow. The fire seemed alive, as though it were watching her. Samantha took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Something about the fire felt wrong. It felt like it was waiting for her, like it had been expecting her. A sudden chill washed over her, colder than before. It was as if the temperature of the room had dropped even further in the span of a heartbeat, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, elongating as they reached toward her, curling like fingers. From the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just out of the fire's light. The figure was still, silent, and unnerving. She blinked and it was gone. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. "Who's there?" Samantha's voice was hoarse, the words escaping her lips like smoke. No answer. She stepped into the room, her feet moving with caution, her senses on high alert. Every step felt heavy, as though the floor beneath her was becoming more unstable, more treacherous. She kept her eyes fixed on the fire, its flames now swaying in a way that almost seemed deliberate, as though they were beckoning her forward. The room seemed to grow smaller as she moved deeper into it. The shadows closed in around her, pressing against the walls, creeping across the floor. The flame in the hearth burned hotter, the air crackling with the heat as it reached out toward her. The fire's light flickered wildly, illuminating strange, half-formed shapes in the darkness, shapes that made her stomach twist. And then, as if in response to her fear, the flames shifted again. A face appeared in the fire. It was contorted and distorted, a grotesque mask of suffering, twisted in an eternal scream. Its eyes glowed with a fiery intensity, and its mouth moved, speaking words that Samantha couldn't hear, though she felt them. She felt the words crawling inside her skull, pressing against her thoughts like 1,000 needle-sharp fingers. Samantha. The voice was all around her, not just from the fire but from the very walls themselves, from the floor beneath her feet. It was a whisper, but a whisper that rattled her bones. The fire erupted into a blinding flare, and in that moment she could see them. Figures moving in the dark, their forms blurred and shifting as if they were made of smoke or ash. They were watching her, their eyes burning with malice. Samantha took an instinctive step back, but the room seemed to stretch with her. The door she had entered through was no longer visible. It had vanished, swallowed by the shadows. There was no way out, no escape. The figures in the room drew closer, their movements unnervingly smooth as though they glided rather than walked. Their faces were indistinct, but their presence was unmistakable. Oh, malevolent. The fire crackled again, louder this time, and the figures halted. Samantha could hear them, feel them. Their thoughts seeped into her mind, cold and dark. You shouldn't be here. The words were not spoken aloud, but somehow they were clearer than any voice could be. They pressed against her consciousness, wrapping around her like cold, damp chains. The force of the presence in the room was overwhelming, suffocating. A figure stepped forward, its face now visible in the firelight. Its features were indistinct, but the eyes, those eyes, stared into hers with a chilling intensity. They were black, empty, devoid of humanity. You shouldn't have come, it whispered, its voice as dry as dust. Samantha's chest tightened and she stumbled backward. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She tried to force her legs to move, to run, but her body wouldn't obey her. The air was too thick, the weight of the room too heavy. The figures moved again, circling her, their presence closing in. One of them reached out, its hand extending from the shadows. The fingers were long, twisted, and unnaturally pale, the nails black and sharp. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to do anything to escape, but she was rooted to the spot. The shadows surrounded her, closing in from all sides. And then, through the haze of terror, a memory surfaced, unbidden, like an old wound reopening. She saw a face, a man's face twisted in pain, his features stretched in an agonized scream. A woman's voice, frantic, pleading. She felt the room spin, the walls closing in. The fire roared, louder now, as if it were feeding on her fear. She gasped for air, her mind racing. No, this isn't real. But it felt real. Too real. Her body trembled, but she couldn't move. Not until the figure spoke again. You are the one. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The words rattled in her head, like a drumbeat. The one who must finish it. The flames in the hearth flickered violently, then dimmed, leaving only the glowing remnants of embers. The figures remained, their eyes glowing, their presence suffocating. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the room grew silent. The figures were gone. The fire had died. Samantha stood there, frozen, her mind swirling. The air had returned to its unnatural coldness, the oppressive weight of the room lifting, but the unease lingered, like a thick fog in her chest. She felt the faint pull of something behind her, something far darker. And then, just before she could take another breath, the floor beneath her cracked open, and she felt herself falling deeper and deeper into the blackness below. The darkness swallowed her whole. The fall was endless. Samantha's body jerked and tumbled, her arms flailing in a desperate attempt to grab onto something, anything. But there was nothing. The darkness was all-encompassing. She couldn't see her hands, couldn't even see her own body as she plummeted deeper into the void. There was no floor, no ceiling, just an abyss stretching out, swallowing her whole. Her breath caught in her throat and she tried to scream, but no sound came. The air around her was thick and heavy, like drowning in the very atmosphere itself. She felt weightless, suspended in some endless, undefined space, and yet, deep within her, she knew this wasn't some nightmare. This was real. This was happening. Her stomach lurched and the vertigo set in. She could feel the disorienting sensation of falling and falling, but it was different now. There was something more. Something waiting for her. The darkness around her shifted, growing more oppressive. As if the void itself was closing in, pulling her deeper into its folds. It pressed against her skin, crushing her, smothering her. The weight of it seemed to seep into her very bones, and she could feel the edges of her sanity begin to fray. And then, just as she thought she could take no more, her feet touched something solid. The sensation was so sudden, so jarring, that it felt like a punch to the chest. She stumbled, gasping for air, her heart racing. Her surroundings were still dark, but the crushing sensation was gone. She stood on something firm, something that didn't feel like the soft, damp floor of the house anymore. The ground beneath her was cold, hard stone. She tried to steady herself, to look around, but there was nothing to see. Nothing but more darkness. Then a faint glimmer caught her eye. A distant light, flickering weakly in the distance. She squinted, her eyes adjusting to the dark. The light was small, like a far-off star, but it was real. She could feel it pulling her, guiding her forward. She began to walk, her feet uncertain against the cold stone floor, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't know where the light was leading her, but there was nothing else to do. She had to follow it. As she moved toward the light, the air grew colder again. Her breath came in visible bursts as though she were outside in the dead of winter. But this wasn't outside. It wasn't even a place she recognized. There were no windows, no doors, nothing to indicate where she was. It was as if she had stepped outside the bounds of reality itself, a place where time and space had no meaning. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the darkness behind her was thick, impenetrable. The light ahead remained her only focus. Step by step, she drew closer. The light pulsed faintly, growing stronger with each movement, like a heartbeat, like a promise of something more. The stone floor beneath her feet was uneven, jagged, and cold, the edges worn smooth by time, too much time. As she continued forward, she noticed something strange. The walls surrounding her, if that's what they were, weren't walls at all. They were shifting, bending, changing shape as if they were alive. As if they were watching her too. A low, groaning sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness behind her. The sound was faint, distant, but it was enough to freeze her in place. It was the sound of something old, something ancient stirring from its slumber. A voice whispered in her ear. A voice she recognized. You shouldn't have followed the light. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing there, nothing but the choking, endless blackness. And yet, she felt its presence. A sharp, sudden coldness pressed against her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her heartbeat quickened, thudding in her ears, a pulse that didn't belong to her. She turned back toward the light, her hands trembling. And that's when she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the light, its outline barely visible in the faint glow. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape distorted and warped like a shadow, but there was no mistaking it. Its eyes glowed like embers, burning with an unnatural intensity, but it didn't move. Just watched her. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. And then, without warning, the light surged toward her, swallowing her whole. She didn't have time to react. The light engulfed her, blinding, searing, filling her mind with images, flashes of things she couldn't comprehend. Memories, dreams, fragments of a life that wasn't hers. Faces, voices, words that she couldn't understand but that felt oddly familiar. It was all too much, and her mind began to crack under the weight of it, pieces of her own identity slipping away. But through the chaos, one image stood out. One memory. A house. The same house. And standing in the doorway of that house was a man. A man with dark eyes and a twisted grin, his face half hidden in shadow. You've come to finish it, haven't you? The voice was not just heard, it was felt. It burned into her chest like fire. It was everywhere. It was inside her. Samantha gasped, her body shaking as the flood of images and voices continued to barrage her senses. She couldn't make sense of any of it. It was too much. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was losing herself, falling apart at the seams. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. The room, the darkness, the cold, they all returned. Samantha was back where she had started, standing in the same cold, empty space. The air around her was still, silent, oppressive. The figure was gone, but the feeling remained, and something was wrong. The floor beneath her feet was no longer stone. It was something else, something soft. She looked down. It wasn't the ground she was standing on. It was the body of a woman. A lifeless, pale figure, her face twisted in an expression of agony. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring into nothingness. The woman's skin was so pale it was almost translucent, and her body was cold, cold as ice. Samantha recoiled, stumbling back. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs unsteady. And then, from the darkness, came the whisper again. You are the one. The words echoed in her mind, hollow and empty, and for the first time since she had arrived in this place, she understood. She had been chosen. To finish it. To finish what? The darkness pressed in once again, the shadows closing around her. There was no way out. There was only the path ahead. Samantha took a deep breath and stepped forward. The darkness seemed to swallow her again, but this time, it wasn't empty. There was something more, something alive, pressing in on her from all sides, pushing against her skin, crawling under her nails. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the very air thick with a sense of malice, of something ancient and hungry, waiting for the moment to strike. But the deeper she walked into the void, the more the sensation changed, the more it felt like it was becoming her own. Samantha couldn't escape the feeling that the house had been here in this place before. That it had always been here, lurking beneath the surface of her mind. She could almost taste the weight of the memories, like dust on her tongue, like something long forgotten but impossible to erase. The farther she went, the more those memories grew sharper, more tangible. Faces from her past, her childhood, began to emerge from the shadows, flickering like old photographs. Her father, her mother, her sister Emily. The faces were distorted though, twisted by time, by something darker, something that didn't belong. Their eyes were wide with fear, their mouths stretched in screams that she could hear even without their words. Samantha stopped dead in her tracks. It was her. The memory of her mother, the one she tried to forget for so long. She was standing right in front of her, but her eyes weren't her own. They were cold, hollow, as if the woman staring at her wasn't really her mother at all. "Mom?" Her voice came out trembling, barely a whisper in the overwhelming silence. But the figure didn't answer. It didn't move. The room remained still, quiet, except for the sound of her own heartbeat, thudding like a drum in her chest. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were spoken, but not by her mother. They came from the darkness itself, echoing through the empty space. A voice, deep and hollow, laced with something that felt like rage. The voice, even now, felt familiar to her. Like an old friend, one she had hoped never to meet again. The image of her mother flickered, vanishing and reappearing. Each time she was closer. Her eyes glowed faintly now, and her lips parted as if she were about to speak. But it was the sound that came next that froze Samantha in place. A faint rustling, like something dragging across the floor. And then, a whispered asterisk. "You remember, don't you?" It was like a switch had been flipped in Samantha's mind. The memories came flooding back, a torrent of pain and regret she could no longer stop. She remembered the house, the one she had left behind. The house that had been her home. The house that had changed her, that had stolen something from her. Her mother's eyes weren't just hollow. They were dead. The memories, her mother's screams, her father's silence, the dark shapes that had moved in the corners of the house. They all rushed back in a dizzying flood of images. The fire that had consumed everything. The smoldering ruins. The house itself, sinking into the earth as if it had been waiting for this moment. Her legs buckled beneath her. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, the weight of the past pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The shadows closed in. "What do you want from me?" Her voice cracked, barely audible. But the only answer she received was a low, hollow chuckle that echoed in the darkness. It was a sound she recognized from her dreams, from the darkest corners of her memories. A voice that was not human. A voice that had always been there, just out of reach. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She whirled around, but all she saw was the familiar flickering of images, fragments of her life, taunting her. Faces she knew, faces she had forgotten. Her father's face, twisted in anger. Emily's face, pale and distant. Her own face, staring back at her, eyes wide, filled with terror. It was too much. Her head spun as she stood, her body moving on its own, her legs dragging her toward the light, the same light that had guided her before. The light was different now. It no longer felt like a beacon. It felt like a trap. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched, twisting like tendrils, crawling toward her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were calling her name. Samantha. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had tormented her for years, the same voice that had whispered in her ears since she was a child, the one that had followed her even in her dreams. It wasn't her mother's voice, though. It was the voice of the thing that had been waiting for her all this time. The walls around her began to bend, the floor creaking beneath her feet as if the house itself were alive, shifting, watching her every move. Her breaths came in shallow gasps. She could feel the walls closing in, hear the whispers grow louder, feel the weight of the memories pressing against her skull. The house was alive. The house was hunting her. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. Her hand brushed against the wall as she stumbled forward, her fingers feeling the cold stone beneath the thin layer of dust. The wall pulsed beneath her touch as though it were alive. It was breathing. And that's when she saw it. A symbol etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was an ancient, twisted shape, two intersecting lines, each jagged and broken, surrounded by curved symbols she couldn't understand. But she knew deep down that this was no mere design. It was a mark of something older than time, something tied to the house, something tied to her. A scream rose in her throat as she stumbled back, her breath ragged, her heart racing. The walls moved. The floor cracked beneath her feet. And then, from the darkness, something reached out. Samantha. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was nothing there. Nothing except for the faint flicker of the firelight behind her. Her hand shot out, gripping the nearest object. A rusted candlestick, its metal surface cold against her palm. She raised it, ready to strike, but something stopped her. The air was still now. Too still. The whispers had stopped. The house was quiet. Too quiet. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a sound. A low, guttural moan. It was coming from the darkness. And it was coming for her. Samantha's heart raced as the sound of the moan reverberated through the air. A deep, unnatural groan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The floor beneath her feet was trembling, the walls whispering, almost as if they were alive, responding to some ancient command. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a noise, it was a warning. She could feel it in her bones, that sense of dread that pressed against her chest, forcing her to move, to run. But where? She glanced behind her, toward the flickering light, the only thing that had seemed like a lifeline. But now it too felt like a trap. The walls were narrowing, the light growing dimmer, as though it were retreating into the void. She was alone in this place, and the house had decided she wasn't going to leave. The moan echoed again, louder this time, shaking the air, rattling the bones in her body. It was followed by a harsh scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. She turned her head toward the source of the sound. There, in the farthest corner of the room, a figure was emerging from the shadows. The first thing she saw were the eyes, cold, black, and unblinking. They were hollow, staring through her, past her, into the very core of her being. The face was pale, its features sharp and contorted, as though it had been stretched too thin. Its lips parted slowly, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. It stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, as if it were gliding over the floor rather than walking. Samantha took an instinctive step back. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its presence filling the room, suffocating the air with its malevolence. She could feel its weight pressing down on her, the air around her growing colder, heavier, until every breath she took felt like it might be her last. It stopped just in front of her, so close she could smell it, a rank, rotting stench that made her gag. Its mouth opened, and for a moment, it seemed like it was going to speak. But the sound that came out wasn't words. It was a hiss, a guttural growl that rattled her bones. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was harsh, rasping, like the scraping of dry, cracked earth. It wasn't just a voice, it was everything, the air, the walls, the very space she occupied. Everything seemed to vibrate with the sound. Samantha stepped back again, her eyes darting around, searching for any way out. But the door, the door that had once been her way out, was no longer there. She froze. Where was the door? The walls around her seemed to shift, their once straight lines curving, the corners growing impossibly large. The door she had been staring at just moments ago was gone. There was only more stone, more darkness, pressing in from all sides. She was trapped. The figure's hollow eyes never left her face. It reached out a hand, its long, twisted fingers hovering just above her skin. She could feel the cold emanating from it, radiating from the tips of its fingers as they moved closer. She shuddered, her entire body trembling in response. The touch never came, but its presence was enough. "You cannot leave until it is finished." The words hit her like a physical blow. She could feel them deep inside her chest, pounding against her ribcage, shoving the air from her lungs. She staggered, gasping, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't catch her breath. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to her knees. But still the figure stood there, watching, waiting. For what? Samantha didn't know. But she was certain of one thing. It wanted something. It wasn't just some monster, some twisted ghost. No, it was something older, something that had been here far longer than she had ever imagined. Something tied to her. Something tied to this house. Her vision blurred, the room shifting and swirling around her, the air growing thick with the weight of her own panic. She forced herself to stand again, her body shaking with terror. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in this place with that thing standing over her, waiting. She had to find the door. She turned, her eyes searching desperately for some sign, some crack in the wall, some way out. There. A flash of light, a flicker of movement. Something in the corner of her video. She ran toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The darkness tried to pull at her, like invisible hands reaching out to drag her back, but she refused to stop. Her breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached the spot where she had seen the flicker. It was a door. A small, old door hidden in the shadows of the room. It was nothing like the door she had seen before. There were no handles, no markings. Just a heavy, ancient slab of wood, blackened by age and time. But it was a door, and it was real. She reached for it, her hand trembling as she gripped the surface. The moment her fingers touched the wood, she felt it, a cold, unnatural energy radiating from the door. It seemed to pulse with life, or whatever passed for life in this place. With a force she didn't fully understand, she yanked on the door, desperate to get away. It creaked open, slowly at first, as if reluctant to let her pass. And then it swung open fully. Beyond the door was nothing but a void, a swirling darkness that stretched out into infinity. It was worse than anything she had faced before, worse than the whispers, worse than the shadows. It was pure, empty nothingness. But behind her, the figure spoke again, its voice low and cold. "You cannot escape." The door slammed shut. Samantha jumped back, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to face the figure again, but it was no longer there. The room was silent. The darkness had grown deeper, heavier. Her mind spun. Was it over? Was the thing gone? No, there was something more. She could feel it. A shift in the air. A tug in her chest, deep and familiar. And then the floor beneath her feet gave way. She didn't have time to scream. Samantha's body lurched as the floor gave way beneath her feet. For a moment, everything went black, and she felt herself tumbling, falling endlessly through nothing. The air rushed around her, a fierce, howling wind that seemed to echo from the void itself. Her arms flailed, her body twisting in midair, but there was no sense of up or down. The fall stretched on forever, a sickening, disorienting experience that pulled at her sanity like a taut wire. Then, with a sudden, brutal jolt, the fall ended. She hit the ground hard, her body slamming against the cold stone floor. Pain exploded through her, but she barely registered it. Her mind was too consumed with the void she had just fallen through, the sensation of being torn apart and thrown into the abyss. Samantha gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to push herself up. The world around her came into focus slowly, and she realized with a sudden jolt of terror that she was no longer in the same room. The walls were gone, replaced by a cavernous expanse, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The ground was uneven beneath her, the stone cold and jagged. It was a vast, underground space stretching out in all directions. For a moment she simply stared, bewildered. How had she ended up here? Where was the house? Where was it? Then she heard it. A sound, far off in the distance, like the scurrying of many tiny feet. It was quick, urgent, almost frantic. It was a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just the sound of rodents. No, this was something far worse, something more deliberate, more alive. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in a labyrinth of stone, a network of tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers from before had returned. This time they were louder, closer. They slithered through the air, brushing against her ears like the faintest of touches. The wind shifted and she froze. The ground around her seemed to tremble. Then a shadow moved in the distance. At first she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her, the darkness warping the stone, but as the shadow drew closer, she saw that it was someone, moving through the cavern. It was tall, taller than any person should be. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, the joints bending in ways that didn't belong to human anatomy. It was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by the darkness. But as it came closer, the outline of its form grew clearer, and Samantha's blood turned to ice. The creature was wearing a mask, an old, twisted mask that seemed to be made of bone and sinew. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light around it, and its mouth was stretched in a grotesque smile, too wide, too distorted to be human. It moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps, its long arms reaching down toward the ground as it shuffled forward. Each step it took seemed to vibrate through the air, like the very earth was shuddering beneath its weight. Samantha backed away, her heart racing in her chest. She had to move. She had to escape. But her legs felt like lead. The darkness was pressing in on her, and the air had grown thick with a suffocating presence. She couldn't breathe. The shadows themselves seemed to be closing in, wrapping around her, making her feel as though the very ground beneath her would swallow her whole. The figure continued to move toward her, its steps drawing closer, each one a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. "You shouldn't have come," a voice rasped from within the mask. It wasn't a voice that seemed human, but something deeper, older, as if it had been buried in the bowels of the earth for centuries. Samantha opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The words were lodged in her throat, choked by the weight of the air. She could feel the presence behind her, the pressure of something ancient closing in. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't let it get any closer. But she was already out of options. The cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, no exit, no door, no light. The creature paused in front of her, its face still hidden by the mask. It raised one of its long, spindly hands and reached for her. "It's already begun," it said, its voice a low, rumbling hiss that rattled her bones. She reached out instinctively, slapping her hands against the stone walls, but they weren't solid. They were shifting, like liquid, like the world itself was bending around her, closing in, suffocating her. The air became thick, stifling, and she could feel the heat of its breath against her skin, though the creature had not yet touched her. Samantha turned to run, but her legs betrayed her, collapsing beneath her. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, the ground beneath her feet seemed to disappear, replaced by a swirling abyss. A laugh echoed in the darkness, and the sound chilled her to the core. It wasn't the creature's laugh. No, this laugh was familiar, twisted, haunting. It was the same laugh that had followed her from her past. The same laugh that had haunted her nightmares, her waking hours. It was her father. Her blood ran cold. "You've come to finish what we started," the voice of her father whispered, his tone thick with malice. "But it's already too late. You should have stayed away." The ground around her cracked open with a loud, deafening sound, and the world tilted. For a moment, she thought she might fall into it again, fall into the endless black that seemed to want to consume her. But something held her back, something pulling her forward. She struggled to rise, but her limbs felt heavy. She couldn't move. The cavern was alive, the shadows alive, crawling around her, suffocating her. The laughter echoed again, and she realized with a sickening feeling that she had never truly escaped her past. It had followed her here into this place, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The figure in the mask loomed over her, its twisted smile widening as it stretched out its hand. "There is no escape," it whispered, the words sinking into her mind, wrapping themselves around her thoughts. Her hands trembled as she reached for the ground, trying to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Nothing but the darkness. Samantha's body jerked as if waking from a nightmare she couldn't remember. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, her chest rising and falling with the frantic rhythm of survival. She forced her eyes open, though they burned as if she'd been asleep for days, and found herself on the cold stone floor once again. The air was thick, saturated with the scent of earth, rot, and something far more primal. The darkness around her seemed almost alive, pressing in, breathing down her neck, wrapping itself around her like a living shroud. She could still hear it, that asterisk laugh. The voice of her father, a taunting reminder of all the things she had buried. The figure in the mask, the thing that moved closer with every heartbeat, was gone now, but its presence lingered in the air. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Samantha pulled herself up slowly, her body aching from the fall, from the crushing pressure of the place. The cavern stretched out in every direction, an endless maze of jagged rocks, twisted roots, and shadows that clung to the walls like whispers. There was no way out. No door, no escape. Just the oppressive, suffocating void of the underground, the knowledge that she was trapped, by the house, by her own past, by something far darker. Her mind spun in confusion, fragments of memories flashing before her eyes. The house, her childhood, the things she had seen, the things she had felt, her father's voice, the mask, the shadow that moved across the cavern floor. What was happening to her? Was it all real? Or was she losing her mind? She stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her, until she came to a jagged stone wall that seemed to pulse as though it were alive. For a moment she could hear something moving behind it, scraping, scratching, as if something was trying to get out, or something trying to reach her. Don't touch it, she thought, but the compulsion was too strong. Her hand reached out almost of its own accord, trembling as it hovered over the cold, slick surface of the stone. Before she could stop herself, she pressed her palm against the rock. The cavern trembled. A low rumble shook the ground, like the groan of the earth itself in agony. The air shifted, and Samantha felt a rush of wind, bitterly cold, as if the very atmosphere were being sucked into a vacuum. The whispers grew louder, churning, scraping at her thoughts. She heard the unmistakable sound of something massive moving beneath her feet, something ancient, something hungry. The ground beneath her feet cracked open. A scream tore from her throat as she jumped back, but it was too late. From the fissure in the earth, something began to emerge, a mass of black, shifting tendrils, thick and squirming like worms. It was vast, enormous, its shape barely discernible in the darkness, but Samantha could feel its presence, a suffocating pressure, a sense of something old, impossibly old, something that had been waiting for her. The thing below the earth was awake, and it knew she was here. It rose from the ground, tendrils curling and writhing, reaching out like long, twisted fingers, grasping for anything. For her. Her body screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the thing that was slowly emerging from the blackness. Its form was shifting, indistinct, amorphous, like a shadow that had taken on a life of its own. But there was something else, something familiar. The house. The mass of darkness pulsed again, and she saw it. Faintly at first, but then clearer. There, inside the mass of shadow, was something human. Or at least it looked human at first. It was a face she recognized. It was her father. His twisted, hollow eyes stared out from the blackness, empty, lifeless, but staring right at her. His lips parted in that sickening, familiar grin. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. Not him. The thing that had once been her father grinned wider, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, the teeth jagged and sharp, the smile a grotesque parody of a human expression. And then it spoke. "You finally found me," it rasped, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated through her skull. "But it's too late. You're too late. I've been waiting for this day. Waiting for you." Her legs finally obeyed her command, and she stumbled backward, tripping over a jagged rock, falling hard onto the floor. The thing in the cavern writhed and expanded, its shape growing, twisting. The tendrils reached out, feeling the air, pulling the darkness closer, inch by inch. It was closing in. Samantha scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure, or whatever it was now, was growing larger, more substantial, as if the darkness itself was feeding off her fear, becoming more solid, more real with each passing second. Her father's face grinned from the center of the writhing mass, his eyes now hollow, empty sockets that seemed to gaze right through her. "I was the first," he rasped. "But you, Samantha, you'll be the last. You'll finish what I started. It's in your blood. You can't escape it. No, no, no." The words echoed through her mind, mingling with the whispers, the growls, the scratching sounds that seemed to come from everywhere. The cavern, the walls, the earth itself, all of it was alive, a part of the thing beneath. But she couldn't stop. She had to get out. Had to move. She turned, her legs burning with exertion as she sprinted toward the distant darkness, toward the edge of the cavern. The thing behind her rumbled, its movements growing faster, more desperate. It wasn't just a thing anymore, it was the entire place, the walls, the earth, the air. Everything had become it. The whispers, the laugh, it was all blending together, building in volume and force. Samantha's lungs burned as she forced herself forward. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what was real anymore. All she knew was that she couldn't stop, because if she did, it would have her. The ground trembled beneath her feet again, and the sound of something massive shifting echoed around the cavern. She didn't have much time. The thing was closing in, its tendrils reaching, scraping, slithering through the air, and Samantha realized with growing terror that it was no longer chasing her. It was waiting for her to come back. Samantha's breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, her legs burning with the effort to push her forward. Her surroundings blurred, a hazy mess of stone, shadow, and shifting darkness. The air felt heavier with each step, suffocating her, as though it were trying to drag her back into the earth, into the thing that waited beneath. She didn't know where she was running anymore. The cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, a maze of winding paths and jagged rocks, twisting and turning in all directions. Every sound, every shift in the air, sent her heart leaping into her throat. The whispers were louder now, no longer distant and disembodied, but closing in from every corner of the world. Her mind screamed at her to wake up, to make it stop, but there was no waking. There was no escape. She staggered through the darkness, her hand outstretched to steady herself against the stone walls, her vision narrowing with each step. Then, just when she thought her mind would shatter from the weight of it all, something caught her eye. A sliver of light. Faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It beckoned to her, a fragile hope in the crushing blackness. With a final, desperate lunge, she propelled herself toward it. Her body screamed in protest, but she didn't care. She had to reach it. She had to find what lay beyond the shadows. The light grew brighter as she neared it, spilling out from an archway carved into the stone, an arch she hadn't seen before. As she stepped through, the world seemed to shift again, the air clearing, the tension around her lightening. But the relief was short-lived. She found herself standing in a small chamber. The walls were smooth, slick with moisture, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. A mirror, tall and framed in wrought iron, stood at the center of the room, its surface clouded as though it hadn't been touched in years. Samantha stared at it, transfixed. It was old. Unnaturally old. and in its depths she could see something, no, someone she recognized, her father. But it wasn't just him, it was her too. Samantha took a tentative step forward, drawn to the mirror with an almost magnetic pull. Her reflection, no, their reflection, stared back at her, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and recognition. Her father's hollow eyes gleamed from beneath the mask, his twisted grin stretching wider, the same grin she had seen in the cavern in the shadows. And then, as if in slow motion, her reflection began to change. The image in the mirror warped, flickering, until it wasn't her father's face anymore. It was her own, but not the Samantha she knew. This version of her was older, wearier, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that mirrored her father's. Her reflection was trapped, staring back at her through the glass as though it were trying to claw its way out. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening roar. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She was caught, bound to the mirror, to the truth it held within. "It's always been you," the voice rasped, the same voice that had taunted her in the darkness. "Always been in your blood." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The reflection in the mirror began to move, its lips stretching open into that same grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. The air around her grew thick with the smell of decay, of something rotting, something ancient. "You can never escape it," the voice whispered, low and insidious. "This is your legacy. This is what you were born to do. What we were born to do." The mirror shimmered, and her reflection stepped forward, raising its hand to the glass, pressing against it with a sickening crack. The glass began to warp and distort, rippling like water as the thing on the other side pushed harder. Samantha stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. No, this couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. She turned to flee, but the archway she had entered through had vanished. The chamber was closing in on her, the walls shifting, constricting, as though the very room itself was alive, feeding off her fear. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape. She spun around, her eyes scanning the chamber in a panic, and that's when she saw it. A door hidden in the shadows, half obscured by a pile of debris. It wasn't there before. It hadn't been. Without thinking, she ran for it. Her fingers brushed against the cold, splintered wood of the door, and she yanked it open with all her strength. The room seemed to collapse around her, the ground shaking, the air thick with the sound of whispers, the sound of something moving. She didn't look back. She stumbled through the door, her heart racing, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She was running again, but she didn't know where to go. The darkness was all around her, pressing in from every direction. Behind her, the mirror began to shudder, its surface rippling like water. Then it cracked. A loud, deafening sound echoed through the chamber as the glass shattered, shards falling to the floor like rain. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare to look. She didn't want to see what might be waiting for her on the other side. She could feel it, though, deep in her bones, a presence growing stronger, more tangible with each passing second. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just in her mind. They were in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath her feet. Samantha broke into a run, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous expanse as she fought to outrun the thing that was pursuing her. But it wasn't just a thing. It was everything. The cavern, the earth, the air, it was all part of it now. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear that same voice again. "You can't run from yourself, Samantha." And then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The darkness was closing in. It was waiting. The ground shook again, harder this time. Samantha's entire body felt as if it were being yanked from the inside out. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she hit the floor with a thud, her palms scraping against the cold, damp stone. Her breath caught in her chest as the echo of that voice, her father's voice, no longer a mere whisper, rang out through the cavern. It reverberated in the walls, in the very air, until it became a deafening roar. "You can't outrun this, Samantha. You can't outrun yourself, asterisk asterisk." She tried to push herself up, but her body refused to cooperate. Her hands were slick with sweat, her vision blurred as the darkness seemed to press down on her from every angle. It was as though the cavern was closing in, the very space constricting around her, suffocating her with its weight. She fought the rising panic, forcing herself to take slow, steady breaths. She had to focus, had to think. Her mind raced, and for a brief, frantic moment, she thought she saw a faint light ahead. It flickered like a distant star, promising salvation. Focus. Samantha forced her legs to move, despite the tremors in her bones, despite the deep, gnawing sense that if she slowed even for a moment, the darkness would swallow her whole. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. She pushed forward, her hands pressing against the stone walls for support, her breath still shallow but more controlled now. The light grew stronger with every step, casting long shadows across the uneven floor, making the path ahead seem both near and impossibly far. Then it came again. That presence. The thing that had been following her from the very start. The air seemed to freeze, thick and suffocating, and she knew without needing to look that it was there, behind her, just out of sight, its dark shape shifting in the edges of her vision. She could feel it, that malevolent force closing in. I'm not going to make it. The thought crossed her mind, unbidden, but it was followed by something else, a surge of defiance. She wasn't going to let it win. She couldn't. The thing beneath the earth, the darkness, it all wanted her to feel helpless, to break her. But she wouldn't give it the satisfaction. Not this time. Her fingers grazed the cool, smooth surface of a large stone pillar as she passed it, and she felt a strange vibration beneath her touch. She froze. The vibrations grew stronger, more insistent, as though the pillar itself were alive. The walls of the cavern rumbled again, this time with an intensity that made the ground beneath her feet shake violently. Dust fell from the ceiling, the sound of cracking stone filling the silence. Then the pillar cracked. A deep, resonant sound, like a drumbeat echoing through her bones. Samantha pulled her hand away, heart pounding, her breath shallow. But before she could react, the pillar shuddered again and a sharp, metallic screech cut through the air. It wasn't a natural sound. It was something else. Something unnatural. Something. A door. A heavy iron door, old and rusted, suddenly appeared where the pillar had once stood. The stone around it was jagged and broken, as though it had been torn open by something far beyond human strength. The door was large, imposing, its edges covered in dark, curling symbols that seemed to shift and move, almost like they were alive. The door's surface was covered in grime, but faint traces of red paint, long since faded, could still be seen. Samantha's eyes locked on it. The door. The one thing that could give her a way out. But there was something else. The feeling in her chest. That cold, gnawing sensation, the pull of something ancient and powerful. It was as though the door was calling to her, telling her to enter. But was it a way out? Or a trap? She didn't have time to think. Her feet carried her toward the door before she could stop herself. The closer she got, the more intense the pull became, like the door was an extension of herself, a part of her that had always been there, waiting. She could hear the whispering voices again, louder now, almost frantic. Come in, Samantha. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the cold, rusted metal. It was like touching ice. A shiver ran through her body, but she gritted her teeth and turned the handle. The door creaked open, slowly, agonizingly so, revealing what lay beyond. It was a room, no, a chamber. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, deep etchings that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The air was thick with a palpable, suffocating tension. But there was something else. Something darker. Something that made her blood run cold. At the center of the room, on a raised stone platform, lay a figure. A body. Its form obscured by shadows, but the shape was unmistakable. Long, dark hair tangled and matted. A figure that seemed to almost float above the stone, as if it were weightless. Her heart stopped. It was her. No. The woman in the chamber was lying motionless, her skin pale, the edges of her body blending into the shadows. But Samantha could feel it. The connection. That pull. The pull toward the body. Toward her. Do you remember? The voice came again, soft, almost gentle. But there was a dark malice beneath it. You've always known. You've always been part of this. Part of me. Samantha's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, to run, but her feet felt frozen to the ground. You've always been here, Samantha. And you always will be. This is your legacy. This is who you were meant to be. The words echoed in her mind, growing louder, more insistent. The body on the platform stirred slightly as if responding to the voice. Her heart hammered in her chest, and the room seemed to close in around her. The walls pressed in, the symbols on them glowing with an eerie, sickly light. She couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. The figure on the platform shifted again, this time more violently. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, pulling at the woman's form until her eyes, cold, hollow, empty, snapped open. Samantha screamed. The woman's face was her own, but it was twisted, distorted. The smile on her face was wrong, too wide, too jagged, like a mask that had been forced into a grotesque shape. Welcome home, the figure whispered, its voice now deep and guttural. like 1,000 whispers in unison. The door slammed shut behind her, and the world went black. Samantha awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as though she had been drowning. Her heart hammered in her chest and she felt disoriented, confused. She blinked against the blinding light, her eyes struggling to adjust. For a moment, the world around her seemed unreal, a blur of shapes and shadows. But then, as the fog in her mind began to clear, she realized where she was. The chamber was gone. She wasn't in the stone cavern anymore. She wasn't anywhere near the door that had led her into that suffocating darkness. Instead, she was lying in a bed, soft, comfortable, familiar. The room was small, quaint even, with an old-fashioned design. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and there was an ancient, faintly musty smell in the air. The light coming through the curtains was warm, late afternoon sunlight that filtered through a soft haze. She tried to sit up, but her body was weak and a sharp pain shot through her head. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she put a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, but something deep inside her told her she had been here before. It felt like a dream, but it also felt like something far more real, something she couldn't quite grasp. Where am I? Samantha's gaze wandered around the room. There was a small window, the kind that let in a gentle breeze, and a dresser near the corner, its wood worn but sturdy. A soft rustling sound reached her ears and she turned her head, startled. A figure stood by the window. She couldn't see them clearly, their back turned to her, but there was no mistaking the silhouette. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark, unkempt hair. It was him, her father. Her breath caught in her throat and she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Her throat felt dry, tight, as though it had been scraped raw. She blinked again, willing her body to move, to react. He turned around slowly as though he knew she was awake. The light in the room shifted, casting a golden glow over his face. It was him, but it wasn't. His features were sharper now, more pronounced. The hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by something warmer, more comforting. But it felt wrong. His smile stretched unnaturally wide, like a grin that had been pasted on, and the edges of his lips twitched, as if the muscles were unfamiliar with the motion. "Samantha," he said softly, his voice low and thick with an almost affectionate tone. "You're awake." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, a deep sense of dread creeping through her veins. There was something about the way he said her name, something that unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. She wanted to speak, to ask him what was going on, but her mouth felt too dry. She could barely get the words past her lips. "What's happening?" she managed, her voice shaking. Her father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet making her pulse quicken. His eyes never left hers, those eyes that she thought she had finally understood. But now they seemed too knowing, too aware. "It's time, Samantha," he said softly, his gaze flickering to the corner of the room. She followed his line of sight but saw nothing. "It's time for you to understand." The air in the room grew cold. The light from the window dimmed, and the warmth that had been there only moments ago evaporated. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and shift. The walls seemed to close in, the space tightening like a trap. And then the whispers began again. Low at first, like a distant hum, but they grew louder, sharper, until they surrounded her, filling her ears. The words were unintelligible, fragments of voices overlapping, but one word, one name stood out. Her. Samantha's eyes widened. She wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. She looked at her father, her real father, his warm expression slowly melting away, revealing the same twisted smile that had been on her reflection in the mirror. He wasn't her father. Not really. "You don't understand," the figure said. His voice warped, distorting, becoming guttural. "But you will." Her father. No, it took another step forward. The shadows followed him, creeping along the floor like liquid smoke. The room was no longer the quaint, comforting space she had woken in. It was something else now, something darker, ancient, a place caught between worlds. The floor beneath her began to pulse with an eerie light, and the walls trembled. And then Samantha understood. The entity in front of her, the one pretending to be her father, wasn't just a part of her past. It was something far more ancient. It had been waiting, following her, feeding on her fears. It had always been there, in the back of her mind, in the blood running through her veins. Her breath hitched, and the whispering voices grew louder still. "You've always been ours, Samantha," the thing in her father's body murmured, its smile now a twisted, impossible thing. "From the moment you were born, you belonged to us." The shadows swirled around her, suffocating her in a storm of darkness. She tried to stand to break free, but the room was closing in. Her body was heavy like lead, and the whispers were inside her mind, scratching, tearing at her sanity. The door to the room creaked open, and in the doorway stood the same figure. But this time it wasn't her father. It was her. Her reflection. Her twisted, distorted self. "It's time to come home," the reflection whispered, her smile stretching far too wide, like a mask that couldn't contain the malice beneath. "Time to join us." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she looked between the two of them. The thing that was her father and the thing that was her, trapped between them, caught in a nightmare that had no end. Her world blurred as the room dissolved into darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers, the shadows, the oppressive weight of the air, it all disappeared. The room was silent. So empty. Samantha stood alone, trembling, her heart beating like a drum in the emptiness. The room was gone. There was nothing left. No father. No reflection. Just silence. And the growing sense that she was no longer alone. Chapter 12, The Last Step. Samantha stood in the dark, a cold sweat coating her skin, her breath shallow and uneven. The oppressive silence of the room felt like a weight on her chest, crushing the air out of her lungs. She blinked, disoriented, as the darkness swirled around her, thick and suffocating, like it was alive. The walls were gone, the floor was gone. There was nothing but an endless, yawning void stretching in all directions. It felt as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving her alone in an infinite empty space. No figures, no sounds, just the gnawing pull of something ancient and unrelenting, something waiting for her. She staggered back, her head spinning, and instinctively reached for something solid, anything, but found nothing beneath her fingers. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the ground, her hands pressed against the cold, unseen floor. Asterisk, this isn't real. It's not real, asterisk. But the thought did little to calm the wild beating of her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, to do anything other than sit in this endless, crushing void. Yet her legs felt like they were trapped in concrete. The whispers began again, those voices rising like a chorus of ghosts, whispering her name, urging her forward. They were everywhere, filling the space, coiling around her thoughts like tendrils. Samantha. The voice came from all directions, an ethereal echo that seemed to come from deep within her own mind. The whisper was both familiar and foreign, an amalgamation of voices that made her stomach churn. She closed her eyes, shaking her head, desperately trying to block out the sounds. The last time she'd felt this powerless, this small, she had been a child, lost in the woods, alone. But now it wasn't the woods. It was this thing that surrounded her. "You've always known the truth." The voice was her father's. No, asterisk it asterisk was his voice. But it was twisted, horrible. The comforting sound she had once known had become a mockery, a hollow shell of what it should have been. Asterisk no, I won't let it win, asterisk. Her hands were trembling, her skin clammy with fear, but Samantha forced herself to rise. She had to move. She had to do something. But where was she supposed to go? There was nothing, just an endless black sea of silence. The shadows that had once seemed so far away now pressed in on her from every side. Then, from the depths of the void, something shifted. A light. A faint, flickering glow appeared in the distance, like a star hanging in the dark. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her only hope. The only thing that could lead her out of this nightmare. The moment she saw it, the instinct to move was overpowering. She pushed herself to her feet and began stumbling toward the light, her legs unsteady beneath her, but her determination stronger than ever. As she walked, or rather stumbled, toward it, the air around her seemed to thicken. The whispering voices grew louder again, becoming frantic, clawing at her mind, trying to drag her back. The sound was deafening now. She could hear them all, the whispers of the dead, the forgotten. She could feel their icy fingers brush against her skin. They were trying to pull her back into the darkness, trying to keep her from escaping. It's too late. You can't run anymore. The voice was stronger now, deeper, more commanding. It was no longer just one voice, it was an entire chorus, a symphony of voices calling out to her, surrounding her. Each one seemed to echo her name, growing louder and more urgent. Come back, Samantha. Come home. Her heart raced as the voices grew louder, more insistent. She could feel the weight of them pressing down on her, suffocating her, pulling her apart from the inside. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. She kept moving toward the light, her breaths coming faster and faster, her chest aching with the effort. Her feet scraped against the invisible ground, her steps slow and labored. And then, the light expanded, growing brighter, until it consumed everything around her. The shadows vanished. The darkness evaporated. The weight on her chest lifted. She was back. Her vision cleared as the light faded, and she found herself standing in the same room she had been in before. The same bed, the same worn furniture, the same peeling wallpaper. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood, but it felt real. Not like the void she had just escaped. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. How was she back here? Had she imagined it all? Was it just a nightmare? But there, in the corner of the room, the figure stood. His back was turned to her, just as it had been before. Her heart clenched in her chest. She recognized him immediately. It was her father. But as she watched him, the nagging feeling returned, the one she couldn't shake. The one that told her something was wrong. It was the same figure, the same man, but there was a shift in his posture, a slight change in the way he held himself. He stood still, unnervingly still, as if he was waiting for her to make the next move. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The room felt too small, too suffocating. Samantha. His voice was soft, soothing, but it was hollow. She could hear it now, a subtle distortion behind his words, like a crackling static in the air. Asterisk no. No. Asterisk. Her pulse raced. Her breath became erratic. She knew what she had to do. She had to leave. She had to get out. But when she turned to run, the door, her escape, slammed shut. A cold rush of air flooded the room, making the curtains billow violently. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to reach out toward her. Her father, turned slowly toward her. The smile on his face was wide, too wide. It stretched unnaturally, a grotesque, inhuman grin that twisted his features. His eyes were black pits, empty voids where nothing remained. You're not leaving, Samantha? His voice was not his own anymore. It was something darker, older. The sound of 1,000 voices, all crying out in unison. The shadows moved toward her, coiling like serpents, reaching out with unseen hands. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in, the floor trembling beneath her feet. There was no escape. Samantha screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then, nothing. The room was empty again. Silent. So, the light had faded. There was no trace of her father. No figure. No reflection. Just a room and the sound of her own breath, ragged and alone. The darkness had returned.